it's going to take a bipartisan solution to fix the immigration situation. Why are there no Democrats with you today? Did you invite them?
Well, about 6 weeks ago, I was with a bipartisan delegation in El Paso and in Yuma, Arizona. As I said, this is the 10th group of senators I've been with to come down to the Valley. And that same bipartisan group that visited El Paso and Yuma a few weeks ago is going to Mexico City on March the 19th to visit with President Lopez Obrador and to visit with the leadership there to see if there is something we can do together. The fact is, Mexico is our largest trading partner, and the healthier the economy in Mexico is, the better it is for the United States. But right now, the Mexican government is overwhelmed in terms of their ability to push back on the cartels that are controlling so much of the drug traffic and the human trafficking there. So I'll stand by my words. The most important, to get something done, it is going to take a bipartisan solution, which means we need some help from President Biden and Vice President Harris. But we're here because we care, and we're all willing to pitch in and do our part. But in the end, it will take a bipartisan result.
Senator,
yes,
what's your perception? Do you think Border Patrol is ready once Title 42 is no longer used?
Well, Title 42, of course, is the public health title that implemented during COVID, and it is one of the tools that's important that Border Patrol has been able to use to turn back particularly adult males. As you know, some of the unaccompanied children and the families are exempted from that Title 42. The Biden administration has issued some new proposed rules that will go into effect in May, and we're looking at those very closely. But the problem is, as you've heard from my colleagues, we don't necessarily need any more laws or any more rules. What we need is the Biden administration's will to enforce the laws that are already on the books. There are procedures in place where our Border Patrol professionals can expedite the removal of people who have no legal right to come into the United States, and there are ways we could expedite the consideration of asylum claims without the terrible policies of catch and release, which do nothing but encourage more and more people to come because they know they're ultimately going to be successful under the current policies. So we're looking very closely at what the Biden administration has proposed, but I'm sorry to say that just passing some more rules is not going to be a substitute for the lack of will to actually enforce the law.
Like the use of the CBP One app?
Pardon me?
Like the CBP One app?
Well, that's one piece of it. If we can get people to come across the ports of entry rather than between the ports of entry, that would be a good thing. But there has to be some consequences associated with people trying to come through between the ports of entry and claiming asylum. Because right now, when they call home or when they watch on TV, they see that people doing that are successful in making their way into the interior of the United States. And as we've heard time and time again from the Border Patrol, what encourages people to come illegally and outside of our regular legal immigration paths is the sense that there are no consequences associated with doing it the wrong way. And the only people getting rich over this are the cartels who care nothing about the people, and unfortunately the families that are suffering the overdose deaths because of the drugs that are coming across the border are paying a heavy price for the failure of the administration to simply enforce the law.
Senator Cornyn,
I would ask consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Madam President, last Thursday and Friday I hosted several of our Senate colleagues for a visit to Texas's southern border. And as you can see, Senators Thune, Wicker, Fisher, Britt, and Ricketts joined me for a series of tours and meetings in the Rio Grande Valley. This followed a bipartisan visit that we made to El Paso and Yuma just a few weeks ago. So far, I've been happy to host, along with Senator Cruz, about 10 separate delegations to the border. Each of those senators saw a beautiful and vibrant region, overwhelmed by the burden it's been handed by the federal government. Since President Biden took office, border communities and our entire state, for that matter, has been forced to carry the massive weight of a humanitarian and security crisis. Border communities are left with no choice but to provide food, clothing, and shelter, medical care, and transportation for tens of thousands of migrants each week. And they're forced to use their local tax dollars toward costs that really should be borne by the federal government. And of course, they're left to wonder how this crisis is impacting the safety of their communities. During our conversations last week, law enforcement officers shared their concerns about the security breakdowns along the border. Given the overwhelming number of people entering our country every day, Border Patrol has to respond and reposition with its limited personnel. As a result, highly trained law enforcement officers are shifted from the front lines to pushing paper. Agents who should be arresting cartel members that attempt to traffic drugs in our country are now spending their days on administrative duties. 108,000 Americans died just last year alone from drugs coming across the border. Of course, this isn't a coincidence, this is a plan. The cartels are smart, they're shrewd, they're scheming, and they're in pursuit of the almighty dollar. They orchestrate migration surges in specific areas to flood the zone and overwhelm law enforcement so they can take advantage of unpatrolled areas nearby. When we arrived Thursday night, we saw firsthand the sheer volume and diversity of migrants that agents were apprehending, from a 6-month-old baby to single adult males. And previously, we've seen sections of the border like Yuma, Arizona, where migrants from more than 150 countries show up and claim asylum. And of course, this is part of the overwhelming strategy of the cartels. Their strategy is to distract and overwhelm. So while professional law enforcement agents are busy processing and transporting migrants, cartels can smuggle heroin, fentanyl, and heaven knows what else across the border. It's all part of a game plan by the cartels, and the Biden administration is getting played. But this isn't news to the people who live and work along the border. They've seen this happening for the last 2 years, but without the support of President Biden, they're powerless to stop it on their own. On Friday, we spoke with local, state, and federal law enforcement about the far-reaching security impact of this broken border. The fentanyl that comes across the border doesn't stay in border communities. It moves to cities and towns across the country, mainly distributed by criminal street gangs who then battle each other for market share, for territory, and of course engage in a whole host of other crimes too, but selling drugs is how they pay for much of it. These local and state and federal officials weren't just concerned about this poison slipping across the border, but dangerous criminals that come across too. Last year, Customs and Border Protection arrested more than 750 criminal gang members and 98 people who were on the terrorist watch list. We all remember what happened not that long ago, 20 years ago now, I guess, on 9/11, when fewer terrorists than that hit the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, killing 3,000 Americans. But the Biden administration seems to be completely oblivious to the potential threat of people on the terrorist watch list making their way into the United States undetected. You can't help but wonder how many people are able to sneak into our country undetected while law enforcement is distracted caring for migrants. Hundreds of thousands of migrants are what Border Patrol calls gotaways, people who are running away from law enforcement, and it doesn't take any imagination to wonder why. The current state of affairs is unsustainable, but President Biden continues to promote the false narrative that only Congress can fix this border crisis. During his State of the Union, Last month, President Biden even said America's border problems won't be fixed until Congress acts. But that myth is easy to debunk. Just compare what we're seeing now to what we saw during the previous administration. During President Biden's first 2 years in office, Customs and Border Protection encountered nearly 4.7 million migrants at the southern border, an absolutely unprecedented and astonishing figure. But during the first 2 years of the Trump administration, the agency reported fewer than 950,000 encounters. From one administration to the next, we saw from 950 to 4.7 million. Congress did not pass any sweeping immigration laws in the interim. There hasn't been any major legislation that might have caused this dramatic increase or restricted the administration's ability to respond to it. Despite the fact that President Biden was dealt the exact same hand when it comes to his authorities at the border, we've experienced nearly 4.5 times as many border crossings under his presidency. 4.5 times. So this crisis wasn't created by Congress, and crisis is not the problem when it comes to solutions. It is the Biden border crisis, and only he can fix it. We don't need to completely rewrite our immigration laws in order to fix the humanitarian and security crisis at the border. President Biden needs to do what other administrations have done, enforce the laws already on the books. The administration needs to get serious about things like expedited removals that ensure that those with invalid asylum claims are quickly removed from the United States. The administration needs to increase detention space so frontline personnel have the capacity to actually carry out their job. They need to stop paroling or essentially waving people into the United States to wait an appointment with the Immigration and Customs Enforcement that is years away because of the backlog. Time and time again, the Border Patrol tell me that what's missing now that existed previously were consequences. Consequences with coming to the United States illegally or by exploiting our asylum system. There were consequences, and that offered a deterrent effect on millions of people that are now coming to the border. So by taking a few simple actions, the Biden administration could send a clear message to anyone considering crossing our border. Unless you have a legitimate reason to be here, you will not be able to stay. That's the very essence of consequences. Deterrence is a key component of a safe and secure border, and until the administration starts deterring would-be migrants with frivolous asylum claims from crossing the border, we will remain in a constant state of crisis. Now, to be clear, I'm not suggesting Congress should just sit on the sidelines. We have an important role to play too. For one thing, there's obviously a need to improve border security. We need to strengthen the combination of technology, infrastructure, and boots on the ground that is the recipe for closing the security gaps that are being exploited every day. Last week, law enforcement told us in no uncertain terms that they need additional resources, and providing those resources should be a top priority. But Congress also needs to address the glaring problems with our asylum system that are being exploited massively. In the Yuma sector, where I traveled with a bipartisan delegation just weeks ago, the Border Patrol sector chief told us that 176 people from 176 countries speaking 200 languages were coming through the Yuma Border Patrol sector and claiming asylum because they knew they would be released to the interior of the United States. So that's a broken asylum system, especially once people ultimately do appear in front of an immigration judge, no more than 15 to 20% of them will have those asylum claims validated, which means 75 to 80% or so are staying in the country awaiting a future asylum hearing without any legitimate claim to asylum. So one of the places we visited was a Border Patrol processing center. You can see that here. And we saw just how overwhelmed the Border Patrol is by the number of people that they have to process. We discussed the growing backlog of cases and the fact that it will be years, if ever, that these cases will ultimately appear in front of an immigration judge. That's unfair to the individuals and families with legitimate asylum claims who have to live in a constant state of uncertainty for years because the system is simply so underwater and dysfunctional. It's also fair to those who do not qualify for asylum and whose claims will ultimately be rejected. They'll end up spending years living and working in the United States only to be told at some point in the future that they have to leave. But the dirty secret, and it's not a secret, is that many people will simply not show up for that future court date, knowing that thanks to the Biden administration's open borders and non-enforcement policy, that they'll likely be able to stay in the United States even though they don't appear in front of an immigration judge at some point in the future. There are a lot of problems that Congress can and should solve, but the current border crisis does not hinge on all those reforms. Madam President, I appreciate my colleagues coming to Texas to visit our southern border, the ones that did last week and the many others who have joined recently on a bipartisan basis. I think it's important for every senator to see what's happening at the southern border. But the constant refrain I hear is because of the drugs being imported into the United States that are being distributed virtually throughout the country, what I keep hearing people say is every state is now effectively a border state. And every city, including Washington, D.C., New York, and Chicago, where many of these migrants have been bused because that's where they've requested to await their future hearing, all of those are border cities in effect as well. The problem does not stay at the border. The problem is all across the country, thanks to the message that the Biden administration is sending that there's no reason not to come. In fact, if you do come, you're likely to be successful in staying. It's simply unfair to the professionals who work on the border, who are overwhelmed by the burden they've been asked to carry and frustrated by beyond belief by the lack of support that they've received from this administration. Essentially, what the Border Patrol has been told in so many words is, you hired on to do a job, an important law enforcement job, but we're going to shackle you and prevent you from actually doing the job that you entered the Border Patrol to do, because we're not going to embrace the right policies and we're not going to provide enough resources for you to actually do your job and succeed in doing your job. So communities across the U.S.-Mexico border are dealing with the fallout from the administration's policy failures. And as I said a moment ago, the Biden administration has tools at its disposal to address this crisis without any action from Congress. And it's time to put those to use. Madam President, I yield the floor. And I'd note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, the overdose epidemic is ravaging communities all across this country and leaving a trail of death and destruction. The latest data shows we lost nearly 107,000 Americans last year alone. The majority of those deaths were attributed to fentanyl, a synthetic opioid made from precursors shipped from China mainly to Mexico, where they're then manufactured. Fentanyl alone is killing 70,000 Americans a year. On average, we're talking about more than 190 people dying each day due to fentanyl. That's more people than a commercial 737 airliner can hold.
So imagine the public outrage if day after day, commercial airliners fell out of the sky, killing everyone aboard. Well, you can imagine what the reaction would be. Social media would erupt, people would protest, and our constituents wouldn't just ask us to intervene, they would demand it. Unfortunately, and this is a mystery to me, the fentanyl epidemic and the drug overdose deaths that we've seen in the last year doesn't get the same sort of response. It's as though our threshold for outrage now is so high that even the death of 107,000 Americans would not achieve that threshold. We know this epidemic does not discriminate. It kills people of all ages and backgrounds, from major cities and small towns all across America. But one of the most alarming trends that we see is the appalling trend of fentanyl-related deaths among teenagers. These teens frequently think they're buying something else, such as a Percocet or OxyContin or Xanax, and unknowingly they end up with a counterfeit pill contaminated with a deadly dose of fentanyl. This is the case for students in Hays County, which is just southwest of Austin, where I live. Since last summer, the Hays Consolidated Independent School District has lost 5 students to fentanyl poisoning. In October, I had the chance to meet with the parents of one of those students, Shannon McConville, who lost her 17-year-old son, Kevin, to fentanyl poisoning. She told me that Kevin was full of promise, a talented person, an artist. And after graduating, he wanted to join the Navy and become an underwater welder. But sadly, Kevin was never able to realize his dream. He died just a few weeks before the beginning of his senior year. A couple of weeks ago, I traveled to Hays County to speak with more families who have lost their children to fentanyl poisoning, as well as law enforcement personnel, school officials, and medical professionals trying to figure out, what do we need to do? I saw Shannon and her husband, Darren, as well as the parents of another young victim, 15-year-old Noah Rodriguez. Noah's parents, Brandon and Janelle, told me that Noah was a genuine, kind young man and something of a jokester. He was an athlete, a devoted friend, and a big brother to his 3 siblings, the youngest of whom was only 2 weeks old when Noah died. Despite their profound loss, these parents and countless others are committed to raising awareness. You can imagine the courage it takes to overcome your grief and pain to try to share your story with others so that others might live. I had the opportunity to learn about the Fighting Fentanyl public awareness campaign in Hays County, as well as the work being done by school leaders and law enforcement. We all acknowledge that there is no single action that will end this epidemic. We can't just focus on prevention or treatment or drug diversion. A successful strategy will involve all 3 of those. We need buy-in from leaders at every level of government, as well as healthcare providers, schools, nonprofits, law enforcement, and, of course, the general public, just like the approach that we're seeing in Hays County. This has to be an all-in effort. But during our discussion, there was broad agreement that the starting point should be the source of these drugs, which is our southern border. All 4 parents stressed the importance of securing the border and preventing fentanyl from ever reaching our communities. Sharon McConville said that when it comes to the border, that the Biden administration is failing. I agree. Last week, 5 of my Republican colleagues joined me for a series of tours and meetings in the Rio Grande Valley where they got to see the administration's security failures firsthand. By my calculation, that's about the 10th delegation that either I or Senator Cruz or both of us have hosted of colleagues coming to the border in Texas. Border Patrol agents told us last weekend about the tactics that cartels use to traffic fentanyl and other dangerous drugs into the country. First and foremost, they distract and overwhelm agents by coordinating a surge of migrants, which provides a golden opportunity to sneak across the border undetected. Overwhelm the Border Patrol with a swarm of migrants and distract them while the drugs make their way north. This isn't news, of course, to the Biden administration. It's a well-known maneuver used by the cartels, acknowledged by the Attorney General of the United States last week when he came before the Senate Judiciary Committee. But for some reason, the administration seems determined to just simply look the other way. President Biden's apathetic approach to the southern border must change in order for us to have a chance at addressing this public health crisis. Just think about a burst pipe in your home. If water's pouring from the ceiling, what do you do first? Well, you aren't going to go grab buckets and towels to start cleaning the water while it's still raining down. You're going to turn the main water supply off and stop the leak at its source. And that's what we need to do here. Cut off the supply. Until that happens, we're going to be fighting a losing battle, and more people will die. It's well known that the southern border is a major gateway for illegal drugs. In the last 12 months, Customs and Border Protection has seized 23,000 pounds of fentanyl at the southern border, enough to wipe out the entire U.S. population many times over. That's a daunting statistic, but we know this number isn't the full story. It only includes the drugs that our law enforcement officials were able to stop. And we know from all the deaths and the wide availability of fentanyl and other illegal drugs in America that much more than that makes its way into the interior of our country. So there's no exact way to know how much fentanyl has slipped through the cracks, but the fact that we're losing 70,000 Americans a year to fentanyl is proof that we aren't batting a perfect game, far from it. And let's not forget the fact that law enforcement at every level is also encountering and attempting to stop the fentanyl proliferation. Last month, the Collin County Sheriff's Office and North Texas Sheriff's Crime Interdiction Unit arrested a Dallas man with about 6,000 fentanyl pills in his vehicle during a traffic stop. Last year, the Drug Enforcement Administration seized more than 379 million lethal doses of fentanyl, enough to kill every American. Drug trafficking is obviously a lucrative business, and cartels take the advantage of every security gap in order to make money. There's no question that the ongoing border crisis has provided the perfect opportunity for these cartels who care nothing about people. All they care about is the money. If Border Patrol agents are changing diapers and passing out meals, as they've had to do to manage the volume of migrants coming across the border, they can't patrol the front lines and stop cartels from trafficking these dangerous drugs into the interior. I want to be clear. I'm not suggesting that every migrant that comes across is responsible for the drugs coming across the border, far from it. But the mass movement of people orchestrated by these transnational criminal organizations, even including people with legitimate asylum claims, opens the opportunity, gateways, if you will, for truly dangerous criminals and substances to come across the border. And unless something changes, it's going to get worse. In order to save lives, we've got to secure the border and stop fentanyl from reaching our communities. That should be the first step. As a matter of fact, the President in his State of the Union last month said that he wanted members of Congress to pass his plan to provide the officers and equipment needed to secure the border. Now that surprised me because I wasn't aware that the President had a plan. But there's no question that border security legislation is needed, and those resources are necessary. We need to strengthen this combination of technology, boots on the ground, and infrastructure that Border Patrol tells me is the key to successfully securing the border. And that's the only way to stop dangerous drugs and criminals who mingle in with economic migrants and others, asylum seekers, to make their way across the border into the interior of the United States. But there's no doubt we also need to reform the asylum process to ensure that personnel, technology, and infrastructure can properly focus on interdicting narcotics and other contraband. Anyone who questions the need for these measures should talk to the parents who've had to bury their children, the brothers and sisters who've lost a sibling, the teenagers who are grieving at the unexpected loss of healthy and vibrant friends. We owe it to them and to the countless people who are terrified by this looming threat to stop these drugs at the source. And obviously what we are doing now is not sufficient. It's not working. I heard, again, Attorney General Garland say, well, we're doing everything we can. And that's not true. He may think he's doing everything he can, but obviously it isn't working, and we can't accept failure. We've got to come up with a formula to address this, as we did yesterday during an open hearing in the Intelligence Committee, where I asked the leaders of our national security agencies, what else can you offer? What other resources, what other authorities do you need in order to stop this dying of people who are taking fentanyl and other illegal drugs coming across the border? But it starts with securing the border, and we'll be fighting a continuing losing battle until that's done. I yield the floor.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, over the years, I've heard President Biden share a favorite expression of his father's. He says his dad would tell you, don't tell me what you value, show me your budget, and I'll tell you what you value. Well, there's a lot of wisdom in that statement. A person's budget shows what they truly value, whether that's supporting those who are less fortunate, saving for the future, or achieving a certain type of lifestyle. The same is true for the federal government. It's easy for leaders to say they value a strong military or fiscal responsibility, but a budget shows whether they really mean it. Last week, of course, President Biden released his budget for the next fiscal year, which gave us an unvarnished view of what he truly values. And in countless ways, it stands in stark contrast to what he's told the American people. The president's spoken about the need to rein in out-of-control spending, but he proposed more than $2 trillion in new spending. Given the growing threats from China and Russia, he said he cares about a strong national defense, but he proposed a mere 3.2% increase in defense spending, far below the level of inflation. So it actually is a cut. He's spoken about the importance of growing our economy, but he proposed additional job-killing tax hikes on Main Street businesses and other job creators. He says he's concerned about energy costs, but proposed $37 billion in new energy taxes, taxes that will be paid ultimately by the consumer in increased costs. And despite saying he cares about the border, President Biden's made it absolutely clear he isn't serious about addressing the crisis at our southern border.
For 2 years, law enforcement and border communities have struggled to keep up with the overwhelming number of migrants that are crossing every day. During President Biden's first 2 years of office, Customs and Border Protection has encountered 4.7 million migrants at the southern border. That's an astonishing, a breathtaking figure. Well, there's a clear need, there's an obvious need to strengthen our border security, and the President's budget request includes $535 million for border security technology at and between the ports of entry. At ports, this could include advanced equipment to efficiently scan cargo and passenger vehicles. Mexico is our second largest trading partner, and that binational trade is important to both of our economies. But this same technology could be key to stopping illicit drugs, weapons, and currency from coming across the border. Between the ports of entry, this funding could go toward sensors, cameras, and other surveillance tools that allow Border Patrol agents to monitor unpatrolled portions of the border and spring to action when necessary. Given the ongoing migration crisis and fentanyl epidemic, which is killing 70,000 Americans every year, there could not be a more important time to invest in border security. While the President's request for $535 million may sound like a lot of money, and it is a lot of money, but when you compare it to other line items in his budget, it starts to look a whole lot smaller. For example, the White House wants to spend $1 billion trying to address, quote, root causes of migration in Central America and Haiti. That's nearly double the amount he wants to spend on border security technology. Over the last few years, we've seen failed attempts to alleviate what are called the push factors, violence and poverty, that cause people to leave their home countries and come to the United States. But don't forget, these migrants are not just coming from Central America and Haiti. They're literally coming from all over the world. Best case scenario, it would take years, if ever, before these efforts would translate into even 1 inch of progress at the border. I've said before what I learned at the Yuma Border Patrol sector in southwestern Arizona, when the Border Patrol chief said, in this sector alone, a sleepy little agricultural community, we have people coming across the border from 176 countries speaking 200 languages. This is a global phenomenon, not just isolated to Central America and Haiti. Well, worst case scenario, the administration flushes $1 billion down the drain while the border remains in a state of crisis. The White House wants to spend even more money on the Department of Homeland Security's Climate Resilience Program. Climate resilience. A whopping $4 billion is what they want for that. That's more than 7 times higher what the President has proposed for border security technology. Now, the mission of the Department of Homeland Security isn't to fight climate change. It's to safeguard the American people. It cannot achieve that mission with the meager budget proposed by President Biden and the lack of priorities. You may think that climate resilience is an important matter, but it certainly doesn't rise to the level of the crisis we're experiencing today on the border with an overwhelming number of migrants and illegal drugs that killed 108,000 Americans last year alone. Of course, the funding level requested for technology is only part of the problem. The question isn't just how much do you want to spend, but what do you need to spend it on? As I mentioned, this is one pot of funding that would support 2 purposes: security at the borders and security between the ports of entry. Both of those functions are essential to our security and our economy, but the White House didn't delineate how it would split that funding. Would it be divided 50-50? Would it be distributed based on need? How would the administration ensure that it was closing the highest priority security gaps first? Now, we have the responsibility to taxpayers to ensure that every dollar is maximized and serves the greatest purpose possible. A few years ago, Senator Sinema, the senator from Arizona, and I introduced something called the Southwest Border Security Technology Improvement Act to help understand the best way to do that. It required the administration to assess technology needs at the border and issue a report within a year. Our bill was signed into law at the end of 2020, and the deadline for that final report was December the 27th, 2021. Well, 15 months has passed, and we still have no report. I've repeatedly asked for updates from the administration, but received zero response. In short, the administration has failed to provide an assessment that is necessary for Congress to determine what the technology gaps are at the border and what the priority should be. Instead, they just asked Congress for $535 million in a blank check. Now, they've offered zero assurance that they plan to use those funds to increase operational control over the border. They haven't even assured us they know what those needs are. Once again, the administration isn't trying to solve the problem just to create an illusion of effort. But technology funding isn't the only problem with the president's budget. It also falls short when it comes to personnel. Now, I've been to the southern border more times than I can count, but I do count 10 times since President Biden took office. And I've spoken with every law enforcement officer and local elected official, nonprofit, and small business owners that I can find. When I ask them what is needed the most to combat this crisis, there is a recurring answer. We need more boots on the ground. We desperately need more Border Patrol agents on the front lines. Now, the administration wants to hire an additional 350 Border Patrol agents, which would be a great start. But the White House isn't taking any action to address underlying barriers to hiring those agents. For years, the agency has struggled to meet its staffing goals, and one of the biggest obstacles is the polygraph requirement. And roughly half of new applicants fail the polygraph, which one officer described as high-tech voodoo. Applicants have shared stories of aggressive and condescending examiners. They've talked about being stereotyped based on their background and traveling to other states in hopes of having a different experience. Still, failing a polygraph or receiving an inconclusive result disqualifies a potential agent. So it wouldn't matter if the White House called for 10,000 new Border Patrol agents in its budget. The agency would not be able to fill those spots until the administration fixes the broken application process. And we've seen no indication of their plans to do so. The White House is also calling for 460 processing assistants at Customs and Border Protection and Immigration and Customs Enforcement. These would be the men and women who would help process the migrants. Based on my conversations with folks at the border, I can tell you these additions are desperately needed. But that's only one piece of the solution. A huge part of the solution lies in deterrence. If people with frivolous asylum claims see they'll quickly be removed from the United States, they aren't likely to attempt the journey to our border in the first place. That's why we just can't staff up on processing coordinators. We need more personnel to actually enforce the law and deliver consequences to those who break it. The Biden administration has refused to do so time and time again, and the Biden budget only makes insignificant changes to staffing for immigration and customs enforcement and removal operations, as well as fugitive operations team members. These are the dedicated men and women who do the difficult but important job of removing people who have no legal right to enter the country. But right now, the system is so overwhelmed with migrants who will not be ultimately granted asylum. So what happens when their claim is denied? It's an important question to ask, because I can assure you ICE does not have the sufficient manpower to enforce the law given the scale of this crisis. In short, the White House has proposed adding more personnel to process migrants and then release them. But it doesn't want to hire more people who will actually remove people who break our laws. Based on his own assessment strategy, President Biden does not value border security because his budget certainly does not reflect it. His budget is not a serious proposal to gain operational control of the border. It's more talk with no action. Our country is experiencing an absolutely unprecedented migration crisis. The southern border has become an open highway instead of a secure checkpoint. The administration is essentially waving everyone through, from migrants with frivolous asylum claims to the drug runners who are carrying fentanyl that kill our fellow Americans. Based on President Biden's budget, he appears content for it to stay that way. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Well, I appreciate my friend Senator Graham for arranging this press conference. He's exactly right. What is currently a flood of humanity coming across the border is getting ready to become a tsunami. And because the tool that the Biden administration has used, Title 42, the pandemic law, the public health law, is going to expire. And unless they put something else in its place to plug that hole, you're going to continue to see more and more people encouraged by the prospect of being able to successfully make it across the border into the interior of the United States. It is astonishing to me how many people in the Biden administration will lie about the severity of this problem, who will try to downplay it, like Secretary Mayorkas, who said the border is secure. Well, if the border is secure, why is President Biden sending 1,500 active duty military down to the border? When they can't enforce immigration law, all they can do is change diapers and push paper. In other words, under the law, they can only perform administrative functions. But this disaster has so many different effects. Just think for a minute about the 1.2 million gotaways, people that did not turn them in and claim asylum. If you claim asylum, you're going to be allowed to go to the interior of the country, perhaps never to be heard from again. So that's the reason people keep coming and saying the words they know they need to say, that they've been coached to say, to be able to successfully make their way into the interior of the country. Some places like New York, it's a 10-year wait before you can even begin immigration proceedings in front of an immigration judge. And then there's the drugs. 108,000 roughly American citizens died of drug overdoses last year. 71,000 of those fentanyl. I was in Carrollton Farmers Branch at a high school last week, listening to parents who were saying, you know, my child thought they were taking something like a Percocet or a Xanax, only to find out it was contaminated with fentanyl, basically a pencil lead. The tip of a pencil, a volume of fentanyl will take your life. That's why the Drug Enforcement Administration and others are trying to socialize the idea that one pill can kill. And then the last thing I'll mention is the unaccompanied children. Because of the way that unaccompanied children are treated under our system, effectively placed with sponsors in the interior of the United States, we know for a fact that Health and Human Services, that is in charge of that, has lost touch with tens of thousands of minor children. We're supposed to be protecting their safety. We're supposed to be looking after them. But the New York Times, for example, has run a couple of investigative stories pointing out that many of these children are being put into forced labor in violation of our child labor laws. Who knows how many of these children that the Biden administration has lost are in abusive family situations, been sexually assaulted, recruited into gangs. All of this comes down to the Biden border crisis and the Biden administration's conscious decision not to enforce current laws and to refusing to work with reasonable people to try to come up with solutions. About a year, maybe 2 years ago now, Senator Sinema and I and Tony Gonzalez and Henry Cuellar introduced the Bipartisan Border Solutions Act, another bill that we thought that if this got bad enough, that the Biden administration, like a drowning person, would look for a lifeline to grab a hold of. And we wanted to provide them with a bipartisan, bicameral bill to begin that discussion. But they refused even that. So I appreciate Senator Graham taking the lead on this issue. This is a bad situation that's about to get much, much worse. And the answer is not 1,500 active duty service members. They didn't join the military. They go to the border and push paper and change diapers. But under the law, that's all they can do is perform administrative functions. They can't actually even enforce the immigration law. So this is a symbolic move that has zero meaning when it comes to changing the status quo. And we're here to say, if you think things are bad now, they're going to get worse come May the 11th. What is now a flood is going to turn into a tsunami.
Mr. President, as the whole nation knows by now, Title 42, the COVID-19 public health law used by the Border Patrol to expel people at the southern border, will expire at midnight tonight. And our border communities in the 1,200 miles of our border with Mexico and Texas, they're bracing for a tsunami of humanity. As we know, over the last couple of years, Title 42 has been one of the tools in the Border Patrol's toolbox to prevent the Biden border crisis from becoming the Biden border catastrophe or calamity. To give you a sense of the impact of Title 42, which will go away tonight, since President Biden took office, U.S. Customs and Border Protection have logged more than 5 million illegal border crossings. 5 million. Because of Title 42, the United States hasn't been required to detain, identify, and process every single person who crossed the border illegally. In fact, nearly half of those 5 million were removed under Title 42, a total of almost 2.4 million people. Consider the countless stories we've heard over the last 2 years about overcrowded detention facilities. I've seen them myself. We've all seen them on television or in the print media. We've seen these shelters bursting at the seams. That was the case when Border Patrol was detaining only roughly half of the individuals who illegally crossed the southern border because they were able to use Title 42. Starting tomorrow, agents will have to apprehend every single person under DHS's, Department of Homeland Security's, traditional Title 8 authorities. The problem is that law enforcement doesn't have the space to hold those individuals, not even close. Last spring, Secretary Mayorkas, the Secretary of Homeland Security, said Customs and Border Protection detention facilities could hold approximately 18,000 people. It sounds like a large number until you begin to look at the number of people who are crossing the border every day. This week, we've already seen an average of about 10,000 border crossings a day. And he says we can detain 18,000 and you're getting 10,000 a day? Well, once Title 42 is lifted, that number will climb even higher. Detention facilities, which are already over capacity, will become even more crowded. And once they're fully maxed out, the Biden administration will simply release people into the United States using what they call parole. Now, parole, we're perhaps familiar with parole in the criminal context, but parole in the immigration context means that they will be released into the interior of the United States, whether or not they can prove satisfy the legal requirements to be granted asylum, and they'll be told to go to an Immigration and Customs Enforcement office in the interior of the United States, in Chicago, in New York, here in Washington, D.C., or wherever they may end up. Unfortunately, immigration court backlogs, because of the vast numbers of people coming in, if you show up in New York and you have been paroled in the United States, assuming you even will show up, which many don't, you could wait as many as 10 years to begin the process of being heard in immigration court. And here's the real unfairness. Consider the people, although it's a small minority, maybe 15% or so of these migrants who claim asylum will have a valid claim. They have to wait in line with the 85 or more percent who we know will not have a valid claim. How unfair is it to those people to leave them in legal limbo because of the uncontrolled numbers coming across the border? Well, anyone who thinks this is somehow a scare tactic or a made-up story is in for a rude awakening. Over the last several weeks, as the Title 42 end date has crept closer, we've seen migrants gathering in larger and larger numbers along the border in Mexico. It's currently estimated that more than 100,000 migrants are already waiting. With this deadline just around the corner, the Secretary of Homeland Security traveled to Brownsville, Texas last Friday to talk about what's to come. Brownsville, Texas, which is at the very tip of the Rio Grande Valley, right across from Mexico. Brownsville is one of 3 Texas cities to declare a state of emergency already, anticipating the end of Title 42. Laredo and El Paso were the other 2, because they're preparing as best they can for an unprecedented surge of migrants. Over the last couple of weeks, more than 15,000 migrants have arrived in Brownsville. Law enforcement and city officials have been overwhelmed by the arrival of so many people, and they're bracing for an even larger surge on Friday. With this as a backdrop, Secretary Mayorkas made an absolutely dumbfounding statement last week, one of many that he's made in the past. He said, "The border is not open, it has not been open, and it will not be open subsequent to May the 11th. It is beyond my comprehension how someone can see what we are seeing on our TV screens or in the media, and to have a public official like the Secretary of Homeland Security tell us a lie repeatedly about the border not being open." I don't know what he calls 5 million people coming across the border. Well, about half of them have been expelled, so let's say roughly 2.5 million after you consider those who were repatriated as a result of Title 42. He said this in Brownsville, which is a city that has absorbed less than 15,000 migrants in less than 2 weeks. You know, in some of the newspapers, they have a Pinocchio test, where they will give you 1 Pinocchio, 2 Pinocchios, 3 Pinocchios, 4 Pinocchios, based on how outrageous the lie is. And I don't think you could count up enough Pinocchios to award Secretary Mayorkas for his outright falsehood that he continues to spew, sitting in the critical position to do something about this. The border has clearly been open, and President Biden and his administration have laid out the welcome mat. And that's why there has been absolutely no deterrence. You know, law enforcement, including Border Patrol, doesn't just enforce the law. By enforcing the law and by people knowing that they are enforcing the law, they hope to deter other people from violating the law. But when people see an open border with no enforcement, there is no deterrence, and so people do what we can expect they will continue to do, and that is to continue to come. Well, at midnight tonight, Title 42 expires. Secretary Mayorkas must really think that the American people are stupid or dumb, but they're not. They're smart. They can see what's going on. They know he's not telling the truth. And for some reason, President Biden continues to keep him on the payroll. You would think at some point somebody should get fired for this disaster, which is about ready to get worse. There needs to be some sort of accountability. If you did something like this in the private sector, what do you think would happen to you? You'd be held accountable. But apparently not in the Biden administration. You can lie to the American people, you can fail to do your job until it gets so bad that presumably something has to give. We know all of us can see photos and videos of the chaos at the southern border. We see it on our social media feeds and on the nightly news. We understand what's happening and we know who's responsible. So the administration is being dishonest when they say the border is not open, and they've made it painfully obvious that nothing is going to change until they're forced to do so. So after a couple of years, I've been writing to the Secretary of Homeland Security for at least the last 2 years saying, when Title 42 ends, as we know it will at some point, what is your plan? What is your plan? Well, on the eve of this looming crisis and catastrophe, after the end of Title 42, the administration has rolled out something they call the Circumvention of Lawful Pathways Rule. The problem is the Constitution does not give the executive branch, the President of the United States, the power to write immigration laws or to stand up new pathways for legal status. If young people who were given deferred action for childhood arrivals have learned one thing, it's that the President does not have the authority to unilaterally change immigration laws. That's something he has to do in conjunction with the Congress. But the Biden administration seems eager to repeat history with this rule, which funnels migrants into new unconstitutional so-called lawful pathways that were unilaterally created by the executive branch. You know, there's got to be a little office somewhere, I haven't found it yet, here in Washington, D.C., that generates these names for legislation or new rules and regulations, which actually are the opposite of what they do. That was true with the Inflation Reduction Act, which didn't reduce inflation, and it's true of this so-called Circumvention of Lawful Pathways Act. It's not lawful. It's not constitutional for the president to do it by himself. Unfortunately, that's just one of many problems with this rule. The broad goal, plainly, is to ensure a more orderly asylum process by reducing the number of border crossings between ports of entry and encouraging migrants to seek asylum at ports. Well, if that were actually what was going to happen, that would be improvement. Those who fail to present themselves at a port of entry would theoretically be ineligible for asylum. And it purports to regulate the flow of asylum seekers into land ports of entry so they don't become dangerously overcrowded. As I said, at face value, these seem like constructive ideas. But this rule is brimming with flaws and exceptions and loopholes that were explicitly designed to ensure that migrants will be released into the United States en masse. I learned as a law student, what the front page giveth, the back page can taketh away. And so while the Biden administration may want to put on this happy face that yes, we've learned our lesson, we're changing the rules, we're going to restrict the pathways by which people can seek asylum in the United States, the truth is they have no commitment to an orderly, lawful, and humane system of immigration. The Biden plan includes broad exemptions for migrants who show up at a port of entry without an appointment and are illiterate, or at least claim to be. It provides an exception for migrants who can't access the DHS scheduling system or who experience significant technical issues with the notoriously glitchy CBP One app. And the department all but admits in the fine print that these migrants will be paroled. Remember what I said about parole, it's just releasing these migrants into the United States and quickly being given employment authorization documents. The exceptions swallow the rule by outlining broad exceptions that can't be objectively evaluated and are easily gamed. If they can be gamed, they will be gamed. The Biden administration has provided the cartels with a roadmap or a playbook. The administration is saying instruct migrants to use one of these excuses, coach them to use one of these excuses, and they will be eligible for asylum, and they'll be released into the interior of the United States. Migrants can make the dangerous journey to the border, show up at a port of entry without an appointment, say the magic words, and still be paroled into the United States. And as the administration's made clear, it plans to expeditiously process migrants who arrive at the southwest border. With Title 42 set to expire and 100,000 immigrants gathering across the border, this is President Biden's plan. It's called expedited catch and release. The circumvention of lawful pathways rule is dangerous and unconstitutional. And I'm in the process of introducing a Congressional Review Act resolution to disapprove of it. This rule would rapidly increase the number of migrants being paroled into the United States while doing nothing, zero, to deter migrants with weak asylum claims. Immigration groups on the left and the right, interestingly, oppose this rule. And some of our colleagues in the Democratic caucus have expressed that they are deeply disappointed with the administration and that it has chosen to move forward and publishing this proposed rule. That's from a Democratic member of the Senate. So I urge Senator Schumer, the majority leader who sets the schedule around here, to allow us to vote on my resolution as soon as possible. The White House has claimed that this is the only option available to address the looming catastrophe, but that's false too. In the 1990s, President Clinton signed a law establishing something called expedited removal. In short, it allows Border Patrol to detain and quickly remove people who cannot prove their illegal requirement in order to stay. Expedited removals have been used by Republicans and Democrats over the years. It's a part of that powerful deterrent that we need to reestablish, so those who have no legitimate claim to legal status will make that dangerous journey, having paid thousands of dollars to a coyote or a cartel to get here. If a person is likely to be removed from the United States within a few days of crossing, fewer and fewer of them will even attempt to make the dangerous journey in the first place. That's the power of expedited removal. It sends a clear message that America's immigration laws will be enforced, something that has not happened during President Biden's watch. President Biden has the authority today to conduct expedited removals. He's had that authority since day one, but refuses to fully utilize it. I've heard the press secretary for the president say, well, it's up to Congress to deal with this. Well, Congress has already dealt with this, and President Clinton signed it into law. It is because President Biden has unilaterally surrendered to the cartels that continue to make billions of dollars and whose poison kills tens of thousands of Americans each year because it continues to flow across the border. President Biden has the tools he needs today. So don't believe this, well, it's their fault. It's the blame game, which is an Olympic sport here in Washington, D.C., trying to blame somebody else, denying personal responsibility. But this one sits at the feet of the President of the United States. Rather than stand up new facilities or hire more personnel to make the expedited removal process function, the Biden administration has instead chosen to release people into the interior of the country at an unprecedented pace, where the expedited removal serves as a deterrent. President Biden's wide-scale catch and release is a magnet. People are being released to await immigration court dates that are years down the road, if they show up, and many of them won't. Some migrants aren't scheduled to appear before an immigration judge until 2032, 9 years from now. Believe me, when that happens, word travels fast, and more people are sure to follow suit. Why wouldn't they? President Biden has effectively said, keep coming. We're going to wave you on through the turnstile at the border and maybe never to be heard from again and never to appear in front of an immigration judge. And again, how unfair is it to those who do have legitimate claims to have to wait in line 9 or 10 years with the vast majority of people who we know will not qualify? Well, this is what we've seen since President Biden took office and decided to undo everything the previous president had done. And the pace is going to do nothing but accelerate once Title 42 goes away at midnight tonight. This administration needs to get serious about expedited removals, about using the tools that are already available. It needs to make sure that those with invalid claims are quickly removed from the United States. And yes, people with valid claims need to be welcomed for following the lawful process. That's what I mean when I say we need a legal, humane, and orderly immigration system. Legal immigration has been one of the greatest things our country has ever embraced. Virtually all of us, or at least our ancestors, came from somewhere else. And we've always tended to attract people who are leaving dire circumstances, perhaps economic, perhaps otherwise, in their home country, who want to come to the United States and to pursue their dreams. I believe that's the secret sauce that has made our country what it is today, the powerhouse that it is today, economically and otherwise. But it's lawful immigration, it's orderly immigration, it's humane immigration. It's not the chaos and the criminality that we see at the border today. Sometimes I ask myself, how bad does this have to get before the politicians in Washington, D.C. wake up and decide to do something? I hope we're at that point. I hope it doesn't have to get worse, because it can get worse if we simply do nothing. But the first step is for the president to use the tools available to him already signed into law. In order to do that, they need to increase detention space so frontline personnel will have the capacity to actually carry out these expedited removals. The Biden administration also needs to stop waiving or paroling people into the country to wait for an appointment with Immigration and Customs Enforcement that is years in the future. Again, that's for the ones that show up. These are just a few of the ways that the president can deal with this crisis today. Those options have been available since the day he took office. He just refuses to use them and tries to shift the blame to others. Mr. President, I yield the floor. Madam President, I'm pleased to join with my colleagues to talk about a topic that I've talked about many times before on the floor of the United States Senate. Obviously, coming from a border state, the humanitarian, the public safety crisis occurring at our border, which has raged for the last 2 years under this president, has finally made every state a border state, every city a border city, because the entire nation is feeling the impact of the open border policies of the Biden administration, because migrants are being shipped to places like Chicago, New York, Washington, D.C. And so the mayors are saying, whoa, we can't take this, even though border communities in Texas have encountered 5 million migrants during the Biden administration. I'm sympathetic, but there's no sympathy. And actually, we don't really want sympathy. We want action to deal with this influx of humanity that will soon become a tsunami. As I said, since the president took office, Customs and Border Protection have logged about 5 million border crossings. Because of COVID-19, there was a public health law in place, Title 42, which we've talked about many times, which was applied by the Border Patrol to expel 2.4 million of those 5 million migrants. But I know the numbers get a little tricky here. But at the same time, Border Patrol has said they encountered 5 million migrants during the Biden administration. They also say perhaps as many as 1.2 million migrants got away. In other words, they were seen on sensors or cameras, but the Border Patrol missed them. Or they simply evaded Border Patrol because either they were involved in some sort of criminal activity or they did not want to get detained because perhaps they didn't qualify for asylum. So up until last week, under Title 42, the Border Patrol was able to quickly expel legal migrants who had no legal basis to stay in the United States. Title 42 is gone, which means that nearly 50% of migrants that Border Patrol actually encountered and were able to expel under that rule, they no longer are able to do that. It's nearly impossible to get an explanation from the Biden administration about where the remaining 2.7 million migrants are. What we do know is the Biden administration is releasing an unprecedented number of these migrants into the interior of the United States. Some of them, if you've got good vision, you can see the green part of these bars. These are people who are claiming asylum. It's really a rather small part of this total number. So far in March, exceeding 100,000 migrants at the border. Just a relatively small number are claiming asylum. So what happened to the rest of them? Well, there's something called parole, P-A-R-O-L-E. Now, we may think of parole as something, if someone's been in prison, they get paroled, but this is different. This is something that the Customs and Border Protection does. They claim the authority to do this on a categorical basis, simply to relieve the load on law enforcement officials and customs officials at the border. Effectively, what this means is even if people aren't claiming asylum, which at least a small fraction we know would have an opportunity to present their case in front of an immigration judge, and a small fraction of the total number would perhaps be able to prove their right to asylum under the law. The Biden administration has said, we don't really care whether people are seeking asylum or not. We're going to release them into the interior of the United States using parole, and tell them to show up at an Immigration and Customs Enforcement office in a town near you and make arrangements for your case to be processed there at the local level. Now, there have been some recent developments. In Florida, a federal judge has now enjoined Customs and Border Protection's ability to use parole, or I should say abuse parole, by releasing mass numbers of migrants, perhaps never to be heard from again. The judges said essentially that parole should be used on a case-by-case basis, not to relieve the load at the border because so many people are showing up. You know, charitably, maybe that's what Secretary Mayorkas means when he says the border is secure. In some sort of twisted way, he thinks 5 million people coming to the border and another 2.7 million of those people being released into the interior of the United States somehow means the border is secure. Well, not under any rational definition of border security is the border secure. So what is the Biden administration supposed to do? Well, back when President Clinton was in office, he signed into law an authority called expedited removal. This would allow the Border Patrol to remove people on an expedited basis, but it takes a little time. And so historically what has happened is those people have been detained until their expedited removal is accomplished. But this administration has dismantled detention facilities necessary to keep people while their expedited removal process is going forward. Instead, they're released. You've heard people talk about catch and release. That's catch and release. That's the big hole in the bottom of the bucket through which this vast sea of humanity is flowing. The truth be told, there's a lot the administration doesn't know, or simply isn't telling the American people about where these migrants are today. Recently, the New York Times did an investigative piece about some of the unaccompanied children who've been released by the Biden administration into the interior of the country, and documented the fact that many of them are in positions where they are performing forced labor, violating child labor laws, unable to protect themselves, unable to provide for themselves. They are simply being forced to work in violation of child labor laws. And they have apparently no adult supervision, no responsible adult supervision to protect them. In a strange sense, that may be the least bad thing that could happen to some of these unaccompanied children. Others, I'm sure, have been recruited into gangs, have been neglected, abused, sexually assaulted, sold into sex slavery. It just boggles the mind. I keep asking myself, Mr. President, what's it going to take? What has to happen before the Biden administration wakes up to its failures on the border and the human consequences associated with it? I haven't even mentioned, the senator from Indiana did mention, the fact that across these same borders, while this flood of humanity is coming across, Border Patrol is distracted or preoccupied with administrative tasks, and so the drugs that have killed 108,000 Americans have come across those borders, including 71,000 last year from synthetic opioids like fentanyl. Well, now that Title 42 has expired, the number of people coming across is going to skyrocket. I've been sort of strangely amused at some of the press reports that said, well, the numbers weren't as bad as we expected. I think maybe that's what President Biden said. Oh, it wasn't as bad as we expected. Well, these criminal organizations that transport migrants to the border and that also smuggle drugs into the United States, they're not stupid. And they realize that the eyes of the world, certainly of our country, was on the border to see, okay, now Title 42's gone away, what's going to happen? Well, they just simply restricted the number of migrants that they transported to the border in order to make it look like there was not a surge. But we already know that 10,000 migrants a day being encountered. One Border Patrol agent said he thought that would go up to 11 to 14,000 a day. The Biden administration has gone to great lengths, not to secure the border, but to make it easier for migrants to be released into the interior of the United States. Earlier this year, for example, the administration announced a new plan to address a specific subset of the border crisis, the way migrants from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela were treated. What the administration said is, we're not going to secure the border, we're not going to prevent illegal immigration, we're actually going to confer legal status on 30,000 migrants from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela a month. 30,000 a month. And then we're going to take that out of the top number, so it makes it look like we actually have less migrants coming into the country illegally. Well, 30,000 a month, 360,000 a year. Without Congress's consultation or consent, we are a co-equal branch of government. The president has no authority to do that on his own. Last week, the administration finalized a rule to funnel even more migrants into parole, which, as I said, is being abused. It's supposed to be done on a case-by-case basis to release even more migrants into the interior of the country. It's interesting the way rules and laws are named some here in Washington, because frequently they're the opposite of what they claim to be. So here the administration has issued a new rule called the Circumvention of Lawful Pathways Rule, framed as a way to promote orderly migration and ensure those who don't play the rules are ineligible for asylum. In addition to the fundamentally false promise that these parole programs constitute lawful pathways, they don't. The rule is brimming with loopholes that were designed to give migrants a clear and easy path into the United States. It's a roadmap. All migrants have to do is claim that they're illiterate or say they experience technical issues with the CBP One app that the administration wants them to use to schedule their appearance at the border. Well, the administration says they could still be paroled into the United States and given a work permit. Talk about a pull factor. You know, we hear a lot about the push factors of illegal migration, and those are real. Violence, poverty, we all understand that, people wanting a better life. But we admit we naturalize or make American citizens out of 1 million migrants a year. But turning this process over to the criminal organizations and cartels that smuggle not only people, but drugs in the United States has proven to be an absolute humanitarian disaster. By outlining broad exceptions that are easily gamed, the Biden administration has provided migrants and the cartels that exploit them with a playbook. They can make the dangerous journey to the border, show up at a port of entry without an appointment, say the magic words, and be released into the United States, courtesy of the Biden administration. Or they can cross between the ports of entry and claim to face an imminent and extreme threat to their life or safety in northern Mexico and be waved into the United States as well. Day after day, the Biden administration is allowing more and more migrants to enter the United States, despite the fact that the vast majority of these individuals have no legal basis to be here. At the same time, the administration is doing less and less to enforce the law and to remove those who have no valid asylum claim in the United States. As you can see here, this is Immigration and Customs Enforcement is the federal agency responsible for removing people who have illegally come to the United States. And as you can see, in fiscal year 2019, it was over 250,000. Fiscal year 2020, it was just under 200,000. Fiscal year 2021, it was just over 50,000. Fiscal year 2022, about 75,000. So not only has President Biden opened the front door, he's closed the back door when it comes to removing people who have no legal right to be here in the United States. Well, this isn't an accident. This is deliberate. This is a plan, and it's an outrage. This is all part of a deliberate effort. I've tried to figure out, okay, maybe they don't Biden administration doesn't understand, or maybe we just have a different interpretation of the law. But I've come to conclude that that's not true. Can't possibly be true. So my only conclusion is this is part of a deliberate plan. You let more people in and you remove fewer people who cannot legally be present here in the United States. The circumvention of lawful pathways rule is dangerous, and it's not a serious effort to secure the border. It's a fig leaf. And I will be introducing a Congressional Review Act resolution to strike it down. This rule is part of the Biden administration's shell game to conceal an unprecedented level of illegal immigration on their watch. Because of the loopholes, it will fail to deliver the serious consequences that the administration claims. And it will fail to deter people from making the long and dangerous journey to our border when they have no legal claim to enter our country. So I hope the Senate will soon vote to strike down this rule and send a clear message to President Biden that his job is to enforce the law as written. I agree with the senator from North Dakota, Senator Hoeven. He said the president has the tools. I mentioned expedited removal, which President Bill Clinton signed into law. The president just simply refuses to do the job he took an oath to do, to uphold and defend the Constitution and laws of the United States. He has no authority to rewrite the laws through executive actions or rulemaking. And I hope the Senate will say so when we vote on the congressional resolution of disapproval.
Immigration Subcommittee, Senator Cornyn.
Thank you, Chairman Durbin, for calling this hearing today in response to the letter we wrote on April the 27th. We mentioned in the letter that the first major indication of a problem with regard to what's happening to these children appeared in a Bloomberg story in 2021, which reported a federal law enforcement investigation in which the Health and Human Services had released dozens of these children to the same sponsor, who exploited them for labor in a poultry processing and similar industries. And then next year, Reuters reported that dozens of children had simply disappeared
in the Houston area and that the Houston Police Department was struggling to try to locate them. And then earlier this year, the New York Times dropped two major investigative bombshell stories exposing widespread exploitation of unaccompanied children. We're talking about 13, 14, 15-year-old kids forced to work in meatpacking plants and food manufacturing facilities. Worse, the New York Times illustrated that senior Biden administration officials like Secretary of Health and Human Services Xavier Becerra knew about this and continued to move children out of Health and Human Services as fast as possible by loosening vetting requirements for sponsors. Two former officials were also aware of this scandal and that these children were being exploited on a major scale. That includes Labor Secretary Marty Walsh and White House Domestic Policy Advisor Susan Rice. To get to the bottom of this, my colleagues and I on this side requested the chairman to bring these high-level government officials in to get their explanation for what happened. And I'm disappointed that they could not be troubled to appear here today. The truth is they don't care. President Biden does not care about the fate of 300,000 plus unaccompanied children that have been placed with sponsors in the United States since he became president. President Biden and his administration can't tell you where these children are. His administration can't tell you what they are doing, what is being done to them, whether they're being exploited for labor, whether they're being sex trafficked, whether they're being abused or neglected. They simply don't care. Because if they did care, they would do something different. So while I appreciate the appearance of every witness here today, the truth is that nobody here today can shed light on the administration's policies and why they just simply decided to loosen vetting requirements. This is particularly relevant since last week the Office of Refugee Resettlement at Health and Human Services published the results of its self-audit, grading its own papers. And guess what? They gave themselves an A. They said, no problem, everything's all right, and that they had adhered to their own loosened vetting requirements and placement processes for sponsors. But this claim is laughable. It would be laughable if it wasn't so sad, if it didn't make you angry, especially given the reporting in the New York Times, which based on HHS's own data shows a massive increase in reports of abuse and neglect just months after President Biden came into office. This chart, which I believe appeared in the New York Times story, shows that in 2018, the number of calls, reports of trafficking and abuse of migrant children, and you can see for yourself what happened since the time President Biden came into office. Those numbers are skyrocketing. But the truth is, these are just the ones that people called in about or complained about. Where are the other 300,000 children? They can't tell you, and they don't care. Well, taking a step back, the UAC, unaccompanied alien children crisis, is a symptom of a larger problem. Basically, that the Biden administration has, through its policies, fomented a crisis on the border by creating pull factors. They let you know ahead of time, if you make it to the border under certain circumstances, you are going to be welcomed into the interior of the United States, never to be heard from again. Because only 12% of the people who actually show up for an asylum hearing actually qualify. But the transnational criminal organizations, the coyotes, the criminals who profit from this, they know that as long as they can continue to move people across the border into the United States, that the Biden administration will not care, will not take steps to stop it,
And we don't know what kind of human misery is being experienced. It ought to make everybody here angry. But it makes me angry that 108,000 Americans died last year of drug overdoses, including 71,000 from synthetic opioids from precursors shipped from China to Mexico and that come across the border. And the cartels know if you flood the border with children, with asylum seekers and others, that Border Patrol will be overwhelmed. And so here comes the drugs, 108,000. And the chairman mentioned DACA, the Deferred Action on Childhood Arrivals. These are young people who came as children, who are now adults, and here we are 10 years later. There's not been one single bill marked up here in the Judiciary Committee or moved across the floor that would provide them some stability. And they've been tied up in litigation and are currently in litigation in the Southern District of Texas. So while some people pay lip service to the need to do reforms to fix the problem, nothing is being done. Our friends on the Democratic side happen to control the committees, then the agenda. Senator Schumer decides what bills are introduced in the Senate as a whole and marked up and voted on the floor. We need to do better than this. We must do better than this. We must show that we care about the fate of these children by doing our jobs. And we're not doing it so far.
Thank you, Senator Cornyn. I'd like to make a couple points, if I might. The hearing today is an effort to learn more from.
Mr. President, under President Biden's leadership, the United States has experienced an unprecedented border crisis. That's not exactly news, because for the last 2.5 years, Customs and Border Protection has encountered more than 5.2 million migrants at the border, plus another 1.5 million gotaways. In other words, under our bizarre and broken immigration system, 5.2 million people basically were welcomed at the border, while another 1.5 million simply fled the Border Patrol and made their way into the interior of the United States. Now, it is true out of the 5.2 million under Title 42, the COVID-19 order, basically public health order, that 2.6 million of the 5.2 were returned to their country of origin, or at least expelled out of the United States. That was a public health order, but that's gone. That's expired. That's served its time. So under any scenario, you can conclude that under President Biden's tenure, millions of people have made their way into the United States, not using the legal pathways that are designed to make our immigration system safe, orderly, and humane, something that I know we all support, legal immigration. Instead, President Biden's failures when it comes to border policy has resulted in transnational criminal organizations controlling immigration. And they also control the drug trafficking that makes their way across the border. And as was acknowledged by the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, when he was testifying before the Judiciary Committee, I believe he said he understood that this was part of the business model of these organizations, these criminal organizations. They would flood the border with people, and as the Border Patrol was diverted to try to deal with that mass of humanity, including unaccompanied children, that left huge gaps in the border, which were then exploited by the drug cartels to move drugs into the interior of the United States. Rather than secure the border or make any attempt to deter illegal immigration, the Biden administration has allowed the chaos to continue for nearly 2.5 years. Now, inexplicably, the president claims this is all part of his plan to promote safe, orderly, and humane migration. But there's nothing safe about the journey migrants take to the United States in the hands of cartels, coyotes, and ordinary criminals. There's nothing orderly about migrants using inflatable rafts and ropes to cross the Rio Grande, where some meet their death when they drown. And there's nothing humane about what's happening in the United States now as a result of the border crisis. First, let's look at what happens to the children. Since President Biden took office, more than 300,000 unaccompanied children have been encountered at the border and then placed with a sponsor in the interior of the United States. To be clear, these children did not arrive in the United States with their parents. These children make the dangerous journey north with basically any adult who's willing to convey them from their home across the border into the United States. But the truth is, these children are not unaccompanied. They are accompanied by the criminals who make this their business. The sad reality is that many come to the United States in the care of cartels, human smugglers, and coyotes, and parents pay smugglers thousands of dollars to bring their children to the United States. I have no doubt that when those children reached the United States, their parents thought they would be safe. After all, this is the greatest country in the world, a country that values freedom, justice, and opportunity. I'm sure their parents expected they would live safe and happy lives while their asylum claims are being considered. But we know the ugly truth. We know now that countless children have experienced a new hell right here in the United States. The New York Times, for example, published 2 bombshell investigative reports detailing widespread exploitation of migrant children here in our country. Some children are being forced to work in meat packing plants, food processing facilities, and construction jobs. Underage children. These are not part-time jobs after school. These are full-time jobs instead of going to school, in violation of many states' child labor laws. They're being treated as indentured servants as they try to pay off the debts they owe to the traffickers who brought them here. And there's no question the Biden administration understands what's going on. And yes, their silence is complicity. Once unaccompanied children are apprehended and processed at the border, the Department of Health and Human Services has the legal responsibility to place these children with a safe sponsor. According to longstanding policy, the agent follows up with a phone call 30 days later to make sure that the child is safe. On both counts, the pre-placement vetting and the post-placement wellness check, the Biden administration has completely fumbled its responsibilities. Health and Human Services actually loosened the vetting requirements in order to get children out of shelters as fast as possible, with little regard for the increased danger to these children. The New York Times has documented that at least 85,000 of those 300,000 children cannot even be reached within 30 days. So the practice is to make a wellness call in 30 days, but 85,000 of those 300,000 children, there's no answer. So the Biden administration can't tell you where these children are, whether they're being fed, whether they're going to school, whether they're being neglected or abused or forced into involuntary labor. President Biden's administration doesn't know. And I think the sad truth is they don't care. Because if they did care, this would not be allowed to continue. This isn't breaking news. This isn't something I'm announcing here today for the first time. 2 major investigative pieces by the New York Times has exposed this scandal. Over the last couple of years, the Department of Health and Human Services has received countless warnings that these children are endangered. Those warnings came through its own hotline, government contractors, and scores of employees who sounded the alarm. Not only did Health and Human Services ignore the warnings of whistleblowers that tried to silence them, department leadership retaliated against employees who shined a light on this massive abuse. As a result, countless children have remained in dangerous situations just so the administration could avoid an embarrassing PR headache. As we know, the tens of thousands of migrant children who've been lost, literally lost, by the Biden administration are not the only victims of the border crisis. You know, I sometimes ask myself, what's it going to take? How bad are things going to have to get before this situation registers with enough people of good conscience and goodwill that they're actually willing to do something about it? And I'm constantly disappointed that in spite of this scandal, we can't find enough people of goodwill and good intentions here in the United States Senate to change this, to make it better, to throw a rescue line to these kids. But the story gets worse. We know the fentanyl epidemic has killed more than 70,000 people a year in the United States just last year, making it the leading cause of death for Americans age 18 to 49, the leading cause of death. We know that the fentanyl epidemic does not discriminate. It kills young people, it kills old people, it kills rich people, it kills poor people, both those living in major cities and those living in rural America. And we know the overwhelming majority of this fentanyl comes across the U.S.-Mexico border. Again, this is not breaking news. This is something known to all of us, including the Biden administration. We also know where the precursor chemicals come from. These are chemicals shipped from China, shipped to Mexico, where the drug cartels mix them up. They use industrial-sized pill presses to gin out hundreds of thousands of pills that are contaminated with fentanyl. Now, most of the time, people who get poisoned by fentanyl don't actually know they're taking fentanyl. They may think they're taking a Xanax or a Percocet or some other more innocuous medication, something we'd prefer our kids not to take, but we understand sometimes that happens. But they have no idea that a tiny dose of fentanyl can kill them, and that many of these pills ginned out by the drug cartels using these precursor chemicals in Mexico are then shipped across the border and unfortunately routinely take the lives of young, bright children who have the best of their life ahead of them. Between October of last year and April of this year, Customs and Border Protection seized more than 12,000 pounds of fentanyl at the southern border. Again, if you have a pencil, and I don't have a pencil, but I have a pen, it's basically the part of the pen that sticks out of the end of the part you hold on to. It takes that little amount of fentanyl to kill you. And last year, Customs and Border Protection seized 17,000 pounds of it. Now, some people say, well, that's great. We don't have a problem. The Border Patrol seized it. Well, you remember those gotaways I mentioned earlier? More than 1 million of them. They were running away from law enforcement, and I guarantee you it was for a reason. Either they knew that their criminal record and background would not make it possible for them to legally migrate in the United States, or they were carrying drugs like this fentanyl. And we know a lot of it's getting through because we're seeing the devastation that it has wrought. Again, with 71,000 fentanyl-related deaths last year alone. So we know CBP isn't able to interdict every ounce of illicit drugs. Far from it. Over the past couple of years, the unprecedented border crisis under the Biden administration has affected all of our missions at the border, including those that have nothing to do with immigration. Law enforcement has been shifted to the front lines in order to process and care for the migrants. Instead of stopping dangerous drugs and criminals, many agents are pushing paper and changing diapers. No one is happier with this situation than the drug cartels and the criminals who smuggle migrants for money. They're getting rich. What's not to love from their standpoint? With fewer agents on the front line, they have a clear and easy path to move fentanyl, heroin, methamphetamine, and other deadly drugs into the United States. And our communities are being ravaged by the overdose epidemic. And the administration has given the cartels clear and easy corridors to traffic even more of their poison into the United States, as I've described. Well, this is hardly a picture of a humane response to the border crisis, as President Biden and his administration claim. This is not humane. Well, as I've said earlier, Mr. President, sometimes I ask myself, what will it take? What will it take to get the attention of the people who actually have the authority to change this, to make it better, to save lives? Because hearing about these crises is enough to make your blood boil. The administration cut corners in order to place migrant children with sponsors. It exerted minimal effort to follow up with those children to ensure that they're safe and healthy. At the same time, the chaos caused by the border crisis has led to a security breakdown, which enables fentanyl and other dangerous drugs to pour into the United States, killing Americans, 108,000 last year alone. Despite the widespread suffering caused by the Biden administration policies, the president and his senior officials just don't seem to care. They don't care. If they did care, they would do something about it. So it's clear to me they don't care. There's a clear need to secure the border and stop the unprecedented migration crisis, but the majority of our Democratic colleagues refuse to address the border crisis unless Congress passes what they call comprehensive immigration reform. So, in other words, they're holding these children, they're holding the rest of the country hostage in order to achieve a legislative goal which they know is not possible. One, because we have a divided government, a Republican-controlled House and a Democratic-controlled Senate and a Democrat sitting in the White House. There's no question that America's immigration system is in need of modernization. It's outdated, it's inefficient, and crippled by backlogs. But as everyone knows, immigration reform is a very, very difficult, thorny issue. For 2 years, our Democratic colleagues controlled all three branches of government. And they couldn't even pass a partisan immigration bill. And now that we're operating in divided government, that calculus becomes harder, not easier. There is absolutely zero chance that the Democrat-led Senate and the Republican-led House will be able to reach an agreement on immigration reform anytime soon. I wish that were not true. It doesn't have to be true, but I think unless attitudes change, that's a fact. Still, this elusive idea of comprehensive immigration reform has become the holdup for other problems relating to the border and immigration. In other words, these emergencies occurring at the border are being held hostage to an impossible goal, which is passing bipartisan immigration reform as a demand for solving these other problems. Right now, the major problem we need to address is the humanitarian crisis fallout from what's happening. We can't prolong the suffering caused by the border crisis while our Democratic colleagues try to build support for a massive immigration reform bill that many of them seem to have zero interest in. Because if they had interest, then I assume they would be rolling up their sleeves and doing the hard work, doing more than just talking about it. For example, in the Senate, the Democrat chairman of the Judiciary Committee has jurisdiction to mark up and presumably pass, with some combination of Republican and Democratic votes, a bill to address the crisis that I mentioned. The Democratic majority leader has the authority to bring a bill to the floor, to open it to amendments so that all senators can participate, to try to find out if there is some path forward and some consensus. But in the 2 years our Democratic colleagues controlled all three branches of government, they did zero about it. That means that the young adults who are in a box because of deferred action on childhood arrivals, this is an illegal scheme that President Obama did unilaterally 10 years ago that's been tied up in litigation ever since and is likely to be held illegal by a court of last resort here very soon. So trying to address that, trying to address the drug crisis, trying to protect these 300,000 children, all of that is being held hostage for our Democratic colleagues to pursue an unattainable goal, given the current political environment. Migrant children are being abused within our own borders. Drugs killed about 109,000 Americans a year. We cannot leverage these lives for unrelated and unattainable measures. There's nothing safe, orderly, or humane about the Biden administration's response to the border crisis. And until something changes, more people will continue to suffer and die. Mr. President, I yield the floor. About what's happening at the southern border. Coming from Texas, we have a 1,200-mile common border with Mexico. That's 1,200 out of 2,000 miles of a border with Mexico, most of which has been in the midst of a humanitarian and public safety crisis for many years, but at no time has it been worse than it's been during the Biden administration. You recall during the COVID crisis, Title 42 was issued, which is a public health order which allowed the Border Patrol to expel individuals coming across the border in certain categories, mainly adult males. Family units and children were handled differently under court orders, but Title 42 went away this last spring, 2 months ago, and for 3 years prior, it had allowed the Border Patrol to quickly expel migrants who illegally crossed the southern border. With detention facilities and shelters bursting at the seams, Title 42 was the only tool that the Biden administration was willing to use to prevent even more chaos from unfolding. In the weeks and months leading up to its end last spring, there was widespread fear that a post-Title 42 border would look even worse than it did at the time, which was a historically bad time. Would the newly set records for illegal immigration be replaced? Would we see up to 18,000 migrants a day, as the Department of Homeland Security officials once predicted? Would more law enforcement officers be removed from the front lines in order to process and care for migrants under the flawed policies of the Biden administration? The migration levels over the last 2 months haven't been as bad as some had expected, but they certainly have not been good either. Last week, the New York Times reported that since May the 12th, the average number of illegal crossings has been around 3,360. Well, that is an improvement from where we were a few months ago, but it's hardly reason to pop a champagne cork and celebrate. For one, the drop is likely seasonal, temporary. Officials and immigration experts believe many migrants are in a wait-and-see mode. They're paying close attention to the legal challenges and other migrants' journeys in order to determine their best course of action. That's also true of the criminal cartels that control the flow of migrants across the U.S.-Mexican border. This is a business proposition for them. They're getting rich, continue to get rich, moving people and drugs across the border, and they are taking a wait-and-see attitude to see, okay, what's public opinion going to look like? Are we going to create a backlash and even a more dramatic response by the U.S. government? Or can we just sort of go slow and they won't notice as we gradually ramp up the number of migrants and drugs coming across the border? It's also likely that many migrants are holding out for a highly sought-after appointment with Customs and Border Protection through the CBP One app, as it's called. It's an app for your phone. As that wait grows longer and frustration grows higher, the decision of many to wait and to use that app in order to schedule a time to meet with Customs and Border Protection officials, that their decision to wait is likely to change. Some areas, indeed, along the border have already seen an increase, including the Tucson sector. During the week that ended June the 2nd, agents apprehended roughly 4,300 migrants. 4 weeks later, they apprehended 7,000, an increase of nearly 65%. So we can see the way this trend is headed. We don't know what the coming weeks and months will bring, but we do know that more than 3,300 migrants are being apprehended at the border every day, which is still a very high and unacceptable number. Back in 2019, Secretary of Homeland Security Jay Johnson, who served under the Obama administration, reflected on his time leading the Department of Homeland Security. He said every morning he'd review the border apprehension numbers from the day before. He considered under 1,000 apprehensions a day to be a relatively good number, and anything above 1,000 a relatively bad number. When the numbers were bad, he said it would put him in a bad mood for the whole day. As former Secretary Johnson noted at the time, 1,000 migrants a day overwhelms the system. Well, that's still true today. Fast forward, and it's true. We don't have the personnel, we don't have the facilities or the resources to manage the sort of historic levels of illegal immigration that we're seeing in a fair or humane way. So today we're encountering more than 3 times as many migrants as CBP did on a bad day during the Obama administration. And the administration, the Biden administration, is trying to celebrate, saying, look at what we did. We brought it down to 3 times the unacceptable level of the Obama administration. And unfortunately, many in the mainstream media are eating it up, this spin or narrative of success. Unfortunately, this number represents only a portion of the migrants entering the United States each day. Of course, there are what we've come to call the gotaways, migrants who were detected by cameras, sensors, and other forms of surveillance, but who are not arrested or processed by Border Patrol. You can only guess what they are up to, but clearly they do not want to encounter federal law enforcement agents at the border. So my suspicion, and I think it's a reasonable suspicion, is that they are up to illegal activities. Probably people who have criminal records who know they won't be allowed to come across. Probably includes a significant amount of drugs that contributed to the death of 108,000 Americans last year alone. So these individuals, these gotaways, could be drug traffickers, human smugglers, they could be terrorists. There have been a number of individuals on the terrorist watch list detained at the southern border, and of course, many known gang members, MS-13, some of the most violent gangs on the planet. The truth is, we really don't know, because they were able to slip into our country and then disappear into the great American heartland. Since the Biden administration began, Customs and Border Protection has logged 1.5 million known gotaways. That's the people that were detected by sensors or cameras or others, but were unable to be apprehended by the Border Patrol. 1.5 million. Again, these are people more likely than not to be engaged in some sort of illegal or dangerous activity. But that's in addition to the 5.4 million illegal border crossings since the Biden administration. So you have to add the acknowledged number, which is 5.4, with the unacknowledged gotaways, and that's obviously almost 7 million migrants. The post-Title 42 drop in border crossings doesn't just ignore those that snuck into the United States, but also those the Biden administration simply waived through the turnstile. Now, this is another way of hiding the ball or cooking the books to make it look like the situation at the border is vastly improved, when it has not. Earlier this year, the Biden administration rolled out a new plan that allowed migrants from 4 nations, Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, to remain in the United States for up to 2 years and receive a work authorization. Before this hat trick that the Biden administration performed, those individuals were treated like every other migrant and subject to being removed under Title 42 or subject to other immigration enforcement measures. But now, because of the wave of the wand, the magic wand, 360,000 individuals from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela have been subtracted from that top line number, because what was illegal is now, due to this sleight of hand by the Biden administration, is presumably legal. All they have to do is submit their information online before crossing the border and wait for the administration to give them the green light. So instead of making the situation better, the Biden administration has taken 360,000 individuals from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela and welcomed them with open arms. This isn't a small program limited to the most vulnerable individuals. It's open to 30,000 individuals a month. Of course, the Biden administration took this major step without consulting with Congress. It acted unilaterally to offer work status for up to 360,000 people a year. And we've talked about this before, but it's worth remembering. The Border Patrol says illegal immigration is a combination of push factors and pull factors. The push factors are things like poverty and violence, a desire for a better life, and we certainly all understand that. But the pull factors for illegal immigration are incentives that are provided to the migrants to come to the United States, whether it's social welfare benefits or, in this case, work permits. So instead of making things better by reducing the number of migrants, by enforcing the law, the Biden administration is offering additional incentives for people to migrate from these 4 countries into the United States because, lo and behold, they'll get a work permit. Of course, there's no suggestion of what happens to these individuals 2 years on. This is a 2-year a 2-year provision, and you can rest assured that if the Biden administration were still to be in charge, there would never, ever be any effort to try to return individuals who overstay after their 2 years is up. So these are individuals who likely will remain in the United States for the rest of their lives under this new wave of the wand by the Biden administration. So this new policy lets the administration roll out the welcome mat. That's one of those pull factors, encouraging people to make the dangerous journey in the hands, in the custody of some of the most dangerous people on the planet, these criminal cartels. This policy lets the administration roll out the welcome mat for tens of thousands of migrants while making it seem like the numbers have gone down. They say, look, the top line's down, but they don't tell you that they've taken people out of that category and welcomed 360,000 migrants a year from these 4 countries. That's cooking the books, where I come from. When you look at the total number of migrants encountered at the border during any given month, these migrants are not included in the total. For example, in May, Customs and Border Protection reported more than 204,000 border crossings. But they didn't include the 30,000 migrants who were admitted under the administration's new wave of the wand, or the potentially tens of thousands of gotaways who were up to no good because they simply evaded Border Patrol and law enforcement. Still, the Biden administration has tried to claim victory when it comes to the border, when its policies have been a demonstrable, abject failure. 3 times more migrants currently being encountered at the border than Jay Johnson, Secretary of Homeland Security under the Biden Obama administration, said would be a real problem. More than 3 times more. And the trend line shows that number going up and up and up. So I just think the Biden administration is not being honest with the American people. And I'm sure Director Mayorkas is patting himself on the back with some of the stories that are being printed saying that, well, the problem has been resolved. Title 42 went away, but the number didn't skyrocket even higher, and he's more than happy with only about 3,600 migrants a day coming across the border together with the gotaways. Under this magic trick by which people who previously would have been considered illegally entering in the country were then deemed legal by the Biden administration. In May, the Department of Homeland Security said the drop in numbers is proof that, quote, the administration's plan is working as intended. And I can tell you exactly what that plan is. It appears our Democratic colleagues are using the same playbook President Obama used to create deferred action on childhood arrivals. Those are the dreamers, the young people who came to the United States as children, who were then unilaterally given deferred action on childhood arrivals, or DACA, as we frequently call it. Step 1, the president acts outside of his legal authorities to extend status to a massive population of undocumented immigrants. He's applauded by the left for taking the action, even though it's based on the shakiest of legal ground, which, by the way, has been held illegal by a federal district judge in the Southern District of Texas. Taking from that same Obama DACA or Dreamers playbook, the Biden administration, step 2, watches more and more people take advantage of the program as lawsuits are brought against the government. The debate will wind its way through the courts as tens or even hundreds of thousands of people put down roots in the United States, which is where we are now. And step 3 will come later down the road. Mr. President, I used at one point just to think this was mere incompetence, but now I think it's actually part of a plan, because we've seen this play out before, and we know where this will end. So step 3 will come later down the road. At that point, the individuals who came to the United States through this program will likely have been here for many years. They'll have jobs, homes, probably even American citizen children. our Democratic colleagues will then point to them and say it's unfair for them to live in a second-class status, so we need to provide an amnesty so that they can enjoy the benefits of full American citizenship. They'll say it will be cruel to force these individuals to return to their home countries after years of living and working in the United States. And they'll frame anyone who refuses to go along as just plain heartless. So we've seen this movie before, and I can guarantee you that migrants who entered the United States under this new made-up program of the Biden administration will experience the same level of uncertainty and fear as the DACA recipients currently are. Their legal status is a result of executive overreach, and as legal challenges are considered, these individuals will be left to wonder whether they'll be able to remain here in the United States. For a party that talks so much about compassionate immigration, this is not compassionate. It's cruel and manipulative and dishonest. The Biden administration is cooking the books in order to make the American people think the border crisis isn't so bad after all. It's deceiving migrants by offering legal status that the Biden administration has no authority to offer. And it's unfair to the individuals who follow the law and who are naturalized as American citizens each year. I've said it before, I'll say it again. We should celebrate the fact that we are a nation of legal immigrants. It's what has made our country so strong and resilient and prosperous. But what's happening at the border is not legal immigration. It is simply hiding the ball, pretending that things aren't so bad, and hoping that the press will move on to look at something else. And it's unfair to those migrants, to those immigrants, who those would-be American citizens, to say, I'm sorry, we can't process your legal immigration application because we're too busy taking care of this flood of humanity coming across the border through these made-up programs like the Biden administration is foisting on the American people. And of course, finally, it's setting the table for another battle over how to handle a massive population of immigrants with legally dubious immigration status. So, Mr. President, it may appear superficially that the Biden administration is making progress on the border crisis, but it's just an illusion, it's deception, it's manipulation, it's dishonest, and it won't last forever. So the simple answer, Mr. President, as the presiding officer knows, is at some point things are going to get so bad that we're actually going to have to do the hard work. After all, immigration law is Congress's prerogative and bailiwick. But as long as the Biden administration can take a crisis at the border with Title 42 in place, once it expires, and substitute essentially a green light for anybody and everybody who wants to come to the United States outside of a legal immigration process, they're going to say, what problem? We don't have a problem at the border. Meanwhile, states like mine continue to experience a flood of humanity coming across, overwhelming not only the capacity of Border Patrol to deal with it, but diverting those resources away from their primary job, which is to enforce the law, including our drug laws. Again, I don't know what it's going to take. Almost 7 million migrants during the Biden administration's tenure. That doesn't seem to bother them. What about the 108,000 Americans who died last year due to drug overdoses? 71,000 of those from synthetic opioids like fentanyl. I've been in very emotional settings with parents who lost their children because they thought they were taking a Percocet or a Xanax or some other more relatively innocuous pharmaceutical drug, when in fact it was laced with fentanyl and they didn't wake up the next morning. These parents are distraught at losing their child that had so much potential and such a wonderful future, only to be killed because the administration is unwilling to do what it should do to be able to stop more of those drugs, including synthetic opioids, from making their way across the border. But apparently that's not enough. 7 million border encounters, 108,000 dead Americans. We know where the drugs are coming from, and we know how to do a better job of stopping it. But the Biden administration looks the other way. And now we'll talk more about this. The facts are coming into view with the 300,000 unaccompanied children who the Biden administration has welcomed into the United States. And once they're placed with sponsors, people maybe not even their family members, they simply say, we're done. We have no responsibility. While the New York Times and other established news organizations have reported these children are subject to labor exploitation, recruitment into gangs, being neglected or abused. And the Biden administration said, it's not our responsibility. Once these children are placed with sponsors, 300,000 of them, we have nothing left to do. Well, as I said, we'll talk more about that later, but we do know that in 85,000 of those cases, when Health and Human Services, the Office of Refugee Resettlement that's responsible for getting the sponsors, in 85,000 of those 300,000 cases, when the U.S. government official calls the sponsor to check in on that child, there's no answer. No answer at all. I think this constitutes abandonment of these children who were welcomed into the United States as unaccompanied children, placed with sponsors, then simply abandoned by the U.S. government. Unacceptable. If you were to do that with an American citizen child, you'd be in prison. You'd be charged and convicted of child endangerment or worse. But that's what the Biden administration is doing almost on a daily basis, and it needs to be held to account. Mr. President, are we in a quorum call?
No, we are not.
Thank you, Mr. President. Under President Biden's leadership, the United States has shattered virtually every record in the book when it comes to uncontrolled illegal migration flows across the border. We've seen new records in border crossings in a single month, a single year, and in a single day, all on President Biden's watch. The busiest day on record came 2 months ago, just before Title 42, the public health title that was imposed as a result of the pandemic. The busiest day came just 2 months ago, just before that title was lifted or expired, when Border Patrol apprehended 10,300 migrants a day. The pace of migration exceeded anything we've ever experienced under previous presidents, and of course, law enforcement, not knowing exactly what would happen once Title 42 expired, they braced for the worst. Federal officials and immigration experts predicted an increase in border crossings when it was lifted. At one point, even the President's Department of Homeland Security said we could expect up to 18,000 migrants a day. Just to remind you, at its height, it was 10,300, but even President Biden's Department of Homeland Security said that could go to 18,000 now that Title 42 went away. It's not as if the President and Homeland Security don't have the tools necessary to control illegal immigration, but they simply lack the will to do so. Unfortunately, that surge that could have happened didn't happen, and we're left with a lot of opinions and guesses as to why that's true. One possibility is the drop could be seasonal. It's really hot in Texas and along that border. There were triple-digit numbers, and traveling across the open range of South Texas can be downright dangerous. If you've gone to the border crossing or the border control at Falfurrias in Brooks County, which is just about 70 miles from the border, where the coyotes, the smugglers, will tell the migrants to get out of the vehicle, give them a jug of water and maybe a power bar, and they'll say, well, you can walk around the border checkpoint and we'll catch you on the north side. Unfortunately, as the cemetery in Brooks County will attest, many of those migrants don't make it because they simply die from exposure to the elements, particularly after experiencing a long trek from their homes. So we don't know whether, due to the hot weather, whether in the fall and in the spring, these numbers will jack back up again. So the lull could be temporary. Migrants may be waiting to see how some of the cases are handled under President Biden's new border policies now that Title 42 is gone. Plus, we have to recall that we're dealing with a very shrewd and smart operators in the criminal cartels. They understand that a massive flood of migrants may well finally trigger some reaction from the administration and authorities, and they may be just metering the flow of migrants across the border so as to not attract undue attention. Well, it could be that this lull in numbers is just gimmicky accounting. The administration has set up what it calls new legal pathways in order to reduce the number of illegal migrants it encounters. In other words, it's quit counting some of the migrants that come across the border. For example, the Biden administration, as part of this program, said, we're going to allow up to 30,000 migrants from Central America to come into the United States, give them a work permit, and we'll make this for the next 2 years. The problem is there's never anything temporary about temporary status, and in fact, this is part of the gimmicky accounting. You simply subtract 360,000 migrants admitted under this new program over the course of the year, and it makes your numbers look a whole lot better than they really are. It remains to be seen whether this program is legal at all. I can't imagine Congress, which has been given the main authority to deal with immigration law matters, whether this could be considered within the president's authority or power. But that remains to be decided perhaps in a court of law. But I suspect that this drop in encounters is a result of a combination of factors. And my own personal opinion, living in Texas, having spent a lot of time on the border and talking to a lot of the experts that serve there, like the Border Patrol, my own view is this is not likely to last long, this lull. But it's long enough for some of the mainstream media to accept what the administration is selling, which is that their new border policy is solving the problem. I'll go back and say what I said earlier, which is even at 3,360 a day, that's more than 3 times what Jay Johnson, the former Secretary of Homeland Security under Barack Obama, said was a real problem. Back in that day, he said if there were 1,000 people encountered at the border, that would be a serious problem. But the Biden administration apparently has no problem with more than 3 times the number of migrants currently being encountered at the border, even if it is temporary. Well, you can see the administration trying to spike the football. Last May, the Department of Homeland Security said the drop in numbers is proof that the administration's plan is working as intended. They boasted that the number of unlawful entries between the ports of entry had declined more than 70% since Title 42 ended. Well, that may be true, but it's tough to brag when the starting point is an all-time record that happened on this administration's watch. In other words, the argument of the administration seems to be, well, it's been as high as 10,000 a day, so now that it's down to only 3,400 a day, it's not as bad as it could be, and let's pat ourselves on the back and say, job well done. Well, 4 years ago, in July of 2019, Customs and Border Protection apprehended an average of 2,600 migrants a day. The July prior, we saw fewer than 1,300 a day. And July before that, only about 800 migrants were apprehended per day. So in other words, the argument the administration is making and the celebratory popping of the champagne cork that all of a sudden their new policies have solved the problem is, I think, an illusion. We've gone from 800 migrants a day in 2017 to 3,300 a day in 2023. The Biden administration wants to argue that this is a good thing. They're supposed to applaud, stand up and applaud the Biden administration's failed efforts to deal with uncontrolled immigration and flow of drugs across the border. As I said, former Secretary of Homeland Security Jay Johnson once said that even 1,000 a day overwhelms the system, and we're currently operating at more than 3,000 a day. So even Attorney General Merrick Garland acknowledged that flooding the border with migrants, as we have seen, obviously that's a big moneymaker for the cartels who smuggle these people from their country of origin across the border into the United States, that overwhelming the Border Patrol and requiring then some of the Border Patrol, in my experience, as many as 40% of the online Border Patrol officers then have to go off the front line to take care of the migrants, to transport them, to feed them, to house them, to clothe them, to take care of the unaccompanied children who are coming across the border, which means they're not on the front lines when the drug smugglers bring the drugs through. This is a pretty shrewd business model, and the Biden administration is accepting it hook, line, and sinker. When migration levels are high, as they are, it impacts all of our missions at the southern border, even those that have nothing to do with migration. Since President Biden took office, Customs and Border Protection has seized more than 1.6 million pounds of illicit drugs, including more than 41,000 pounds of fentanyl. Now, we talked about this in Judiciary Committee today, and the scourge of fentanyl, and the fact that last year alone it took 71,000 American lives. Unfortunately, many of those lives were the age of some of our pages and high school students who thought they were taking something relatively innocuous, only to find out it was a counterfeit drug laced with fentanyl, which took their lives tragically and prematurely. Some would point to the seizures of drugs and say, we're successful, we're being successful, we're stopping the drugs from coming across, which I submit is looking at this the wrong way. We ought to look at the volumes of drugs seized and recognize that there's a whole lot more that's gotten through. Just during the Biden administration, there have been what the Border Patrol calls 1.5 million gotaways. These are people who are not turning themselves in, claiming asylum. These are people who are fleeing from law enforcement, who are being picked up on cameras and other sensors, but then simply evading detention and detection by the Border Patrol. I can't possibly buy the argument that these people are up to good. I think they're up to no good. They're either people convicted with criminal records or other law enforcement problems, or simply drug mules carrying more of this poison across the border. I am grateful to our hardworking officers and agents who interdicted these drugs, but we know these data points do not tell the full story. These are only the drugs that they were able to identify and to stop, given the fact that countless agents were taken off the front lines in order to care for the flood of humanity. What President Obama said, even under much smaller numbers, he called it a humanitarian crisis. There's no question that more drugs have slipped through the cracks. While the agents are busy processing and transporting migrants, it clears a highway across the border to smuggle fentanyl, heroin, and heaven knows what else across the border. So there's no way to know what we don't know, but the fact that we're losing more than 108,000 Americans a year to drug overdoses is proof that we are not being successful at interdicting the drugs that come across the border. That seems obvious. Well, one of the many victims of fentanyl poisoning is a 17-year-old from Texas named Kevin McConville. Last fall, just 2 weeks before the start of the school year, his senior year, Kevin took a pill he thought would help him fall asleep. Little did he know that it was laced with a deadly dose of fentanyl, and he didn't wake up the next morning. His mom, Shannon, found him the next morning too late. Like many parents and family members who lost a loved one to fentanyl, Sharon and her husband, Darren, are on a mission to end the fentanyl epidemic. Matter of fact, in Farmers Branch, Texas, a father who lost a young daughter gave me this bracelet, which says, among other things, one pill can kill. That's part of the public education efforts that many of our school districts and others, public health officials, are undertaking to make sure our children understand there is no such thing as an innocuous or safe illicit drug. When I spoke with Shannon and Darren in February, Shannon was adamant about the need to do more to stop fentanyl from entering our country in the first place. And the most critical place to do that is where it crosses our southern border from Mexico, where it comes from. The vast majority of fentanyl comes to the United States from Mexico, made from chemical precursors imported from China. If we're going to have a shot at ending the fentanyl epidemic, we have to go to the source rather than just deal with the symptoms. This morning, as the presiding officer knows, in Judiciary Committee, we talked about people selling drugs using social media platforms. And certainly that is something we all abhor and ought to do what we can to stop. And we'll be debating that more. But as important a step as that is, it's only one brick in the wall. It's only a baby step in terms of dealing with the fentanyl crisis, because we have to stop it at the source, not deal with it once it's made its way into our country. Until that happens, law enforcement and drug treatment facilities across this nation will be fighting a losing battle. Shannon told me that when it comes to the border, the Biden administration is failing, and I agree with her. President Biden has completely abdicated his border security responsibilities for more than 2.5 years, leading to catastrophic and deadly consequences. 5.4 million border crossings. In addition to that, another 1.5 million gotaways for almost 7 million migrants transiting our southern border. 108,000 drug overdoses last year. 85,000 migrant children lost after having been placed with sponsors in the interior of the United States by the Biden administration. When officials tried to contact those sponsors to check on the welfare of those children, there was no answer. And there was also no follow-up by the Biden administration. We don't know whether these kids are going to school, whether they're getting the health care they need, whether they're being forced into involuntary servitude, whether they're being sexually abused or neglected. We just don't know. And the Biden administration cannot tell you. And that, Mr. President, is completely unacceptable. If any official did that to an American citizen child, They would be prosecuted and, I believe, convicted of child endangerment, human trafficking, and other sorts of offenses. But because these are migrant children, the Biden administration says, hey, we've done our job, we put them with sponsors, now it's somebody else's responsibility. Well, there is nobody else to deal with that. The Child Protective Services in New Jersey, in Texas, and elsewhere are already overwhelmed. And so to say to the states, now it's your job to protect these children, once we've allowed 300,000 of them into the United States and placed them with sponsors because of misguided border policies, is a complete abdication of responsibility. Well, 2.5 years of failed border policies cannot be erased by a couple of months of reduced migration. It is premature, to say the least, to declare victory, to spike the ball, to pop a cork. The fact that we are not currently experiencing record-breaking migration levels is, admittedly, a step in the right direction, but it's not victory. There's still a crisis occurring. The number of border crossings is still historically high. Law enforcement remains under tremendous strain, and the southern border is far from secure. If the administration spent half as much time trying to solve the problem as it does trying to spin it, we'd be in a much better place. And Mr. President, I have to say that there are those of us here, presiding officer included, who would like to be part of the solution. We've asked the administration, we've asked the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Senator Durbin, to bring legislation to the Judiciary Committee, which has jurisdiction over these matters, give senators on the Republican side and Democratic side a chance to debate it and amend it and pass a bill out of the Judiciary Committee that would address this crisis. We've asked the Majority Leader, Senator Schumer, to encourage the chairman of the Judiciary Committee to bring a bill out of the committee and bring it to the floor. Let us do our job. There's nobody else to fix this problem other than us, those of us who've asked the enormous privilege of serving our constituents here in the nation's greatest deliberative body, the United States Senate, or in the House of Representatives. But all we get are crickets. I keep asking myself, Mr. President, what will it take? What will it take to get the president's attention? What will it take to get the attention of our Democratic colleagues who are in leadership positions and who are able to make this, put this on the agenda and do something about it? Obviously, 6.9 million migrants coming across the border in the last 2.5 years isn't enough to get their attention. Obviously, 108,000 dead Americans is not enough to get their attention. 300,000 unaccompanied children lost to the administration who can't tell you where they are or what's happening to them has so far not gotten their attention. But it should get our attention. We are in a position of responsibility, given the privilege of serving in this body and in the United States Congress, and we ought to do something about it. So if it doesn't start at the White House, if it doesn't start in the leadership here in the United States Senate, rank and file members of the Senate can do something about it. And we can force the leadership at the White House and in the Congress to accept their responsibilities and do something about the devastation and death that's occurring as a result of these uncontrolled borders. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk.
No one wants to move the left, I see. The camera's off on the right.
Good morning, everybody. We're here to talk about the open borders policy of the Biden administration and what sort of damage that has caused to Americans no matter where you live, not just along the border region. In particular, I want to emphasize the concerns I have, and I think average Americans would also have, about the 300,000 children who've been placed with sponsors by the Biden administration's HHS, Health and Human Services, or Office of Refugee Relocation. The New York Times did an investigative piece recently, a couple of them actually, documenting forced labor among some of those children who have been placed with sponsors. But one of the most shocking statistics that was revealed in those stories, that of the 300,000 children who've been placed with sponsors in the United States, not necessarily relatives, could be a parent, could be a distant relative, but could just be a foster home, that in 85,000 of those placements, the 30-day wellness call that is typically made by the administration went unanswered. And so not only does the Biden administration not know where 300,000 children currently reside, what's happening to them, whether they're going to school, whether they're getting health care, whether they're being recruited for gangs, whether they're being trafficked for sex, or just simply neglected or abused, the Biden administration doesn't know. And the truth is they don't care. Because if they did know, they would do something about it. But they refuse to do so, even though, as the New York Times documented, high-level officials like Marty Walsh, the former Secretary of Labor, Susan Rice, former domestic policy advisor, among others, were told about what was going on and yet refused to do anything about it. You know, I've wondered as a border state senator, what's it going to take to get the attention of the Biden administration to finally do something about the Biden border crisis? Well, obviously 300,000 children who are in the United States that they don't know what they are or what's happening to them, what their circumstances are. That's not enough to move them. How about 108,000 dead Americans? Dead because they consumed some of the drugs that are smuggled across the southwestern border, including 71,000 from fentanyl. I've gone to high schools, I'm sure my colleagues have too, and grieved with the parents and school officials over kids who thought they were taking a Xanax or a Percocet, but in fact were taking a counterfeit pill laced with fentanyl, enough to kill them. I still wear a wrist bracelet from one I got in Carrollton Farmers Branch, where a father gave me a bracelet that commemorates his daughter who lost her own life as a result of a fentanyl poisoning, and it says, "One pill can kill." Trying to raise public awareness to this scourge. So if 300,000 lost children won't get the Biden administration attention, how about 108,000 dead Americans? Well, apparently that's not even enough to move them. Finally, let me just say, even the Attorney General of the United States acknowledged that the mass migration of individuals across the border was really part of a larger game plan. First of all, it makes these transnational criminal organizations, the cartels, rich. But secondly, by diverting Border Patrol, taking them off the front lines so they can attend to administrative duties like feeding these unaccompanied children, changing diapers and the like, that's created a huge opportunity for the drugs to come across, which again contributed to the death of 108,000 Americans last year. So we're here today to ask, what will it take? What will it take to finally get the Biden administration to wake up to their failed open border policies? And how many more people need to die? How many more children need to be lost before the Biden administration finally agrees to work with us on a bipartisan basis to address this problem? Senator Langford.
Senator Cornyn, thanks for your leadership on this.
Senator Graham mentioned a number of numbers. Let me mention three. 7 million border encounters since President Biden has become president. That includes people who literally turned themselves in because then they claimed amnesty, knowing that they could exploit our broken asylum policies in order to permanently reside in the United States. But it also included 1.5 million gotaways. These are people evading law enforcement, and frankly, I think you can surmise they're probably up to no good. And it could be that maybe they're carrying some of the fentanyl that took the lives of 71,000 Americans last year alone. The second number, and I mentioned a few others, but the second number is 108,000. That's how many Americans died from drugs smuggled across the U.S.-Mexico border last year alone. That includes the 71,000 dead from fentanyl. And then there's a number 300,000. That's the number of unaccompanied children who were placed with sponsors in the United States. The New York Times did a great series of trying to find out what was happening to these children, and they documented the fact that in 85,000 phone calls to the sponsor 30 days after the child was placed with the sponsor, there was no answer. And unfortunately, they were also able to document forced labor. But the Biden administration has simply lost these children and does not consider it their responsibility. They can't tell you whether they're going to school. They can't tell you whether they're being exploited, whether they're being sex trafficked, whether they're being neglected. They just can't tell you. And frankly, they don't care. So to me, that's the message that the Biden administration has sent for the last almost 3 years now. They don't care. If they did care, they would do something about it. We're here to work with them, if they will work with us, to try to create a lawful, humane, and safe legal immigration system. That's what our country needs. That's what we do not have now.
Senator Black.
Can be taken to improve the efficiency of our courts while preserving due process. And with that, looking forward to today's hearing, I now turn it over to Ranking Member Cornyn for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You and I get along very well together. We've done a lot of important work together, but I couldn't disagree more about the priorities that you've discussed in your opening statement. Just since President Biden has been in office, there have been roughly 7 million people cross our border. Many of them turn themselves in, claiming asylum. Others are released on humanitarian parole in huge numbers. There have been 1.5 million gotaways, is what the Border Patrol calls them. Of course, if you're evading law enforcement, it tells me that maybe you're doing something you might not should be doing, like smuggling fentanyl and other drugs into the United States. The administration has the audacity to claim that all of the illegal drugs that come into our country come across the ports of entry. That's just not true. They have no idea what's happening between the ports of entry with all of the gotaways that come across. And of course, there's the fact that 108,000 Americans died of drugs, mainly that crossed the southern border. Certainly the fentanyl, the 71,000 Americans who are dead as a result of fentanyl poisoning from last year alone. Those came across the border from Mexico, made out of chemical precursors from China. And then really the untold story of the status quo under the Biden administration is the 300,000 children who've been placed with sponsors in the interior of the United States. And as the New York Times has documented recently in an investigative story, 85,000 wellness calls were made by the U.S. government to these sponsors 30 days after the child was placed with the sponsor, and there was no answer. And so the Biden administration cannot tell you what the status of those children is. We do know that, as documented in some of these investigative stories, that some of these children have been put into forced labor, dangerous jobs that they should not be performing. We don't know whether they're being trafficked for sex. We don't know whether they're being neglected, abused. The Biden administration can't tell you because they don't, frankly, care. And if they did care, they would actually do something about it. So I just hold a very different view that this particular matter, as important as it is, and I agree it's important, independence of the courts is something that near and dear to my heart, having served on the state court bench for 13 years. But the courts can only do so much when the Biden administration has opened the spigot at the border. And as you know, there's roughly, according to one count, 2.6 million cases pending. Our immigration judges can't do their job just being flooded with these huge numbers. And so what does the Biden administration do? Well, they end up basically taking cases off of the docket on the back end, which make the numbers actually look better, but do not actually enforce U.S. law. So I agree with you that, that some of the measures people like to talk about, like physical infrastructure, is not an end-all, be-all. It is a piece of the puzzle. Certainly technology and boots on the ground are important, but policy changes are important too. As I suggested, there are people who literally come to the United States and turn themselves in and claim asylum, knowing that they can beat the system, that they will be, if they are given a notice to appear at all, it may be for years in the future, and who knows whether they decide to show up or not for that hearing. There's no consequences associated with not showing up, unless, of course, they happen to get arrested for a crime in a local jurisdiction and somebody actually checks to see what their immigration status should be. But we also know that there, in addition to the 2.6 million cases pending, in about 1.3 million cases, these migrants are given a notice to appear, or not a notice to appear, a notice to report, I guess it's called, to an ICE facility in the interior of the United States, and then to start the process once they turn themselves in. Again, you know, you might ask yourself how many people will, if they haven't complied with our laws otherwise, why in the world would you think that they're going to turn themselves into ICE so they can get in the line for an immigration hearing, where roughly 80% of the people can't qualify for asylum? And to me, one of the tragedies of this is I believe that asylum should be available to people who can meet the standard. But we have literally millions of people in line waiting for a hearing in an immigration court, clogging the courts, overburdening the courts, when only 15, maybe 20% can qualify. So that means that the 15 to 20% who can qualify can't get to court on a timely basis because of the other 80% that are in line. So this is an unmitigated disaster. And while I do, as I said earlier, believe in the importance of independence of the courts and will listen closely, I just think this is not the top priority. If you look at the public polling on President Biden's approval rating on how he's dealing with what's happening at the border now, which happens to be 1,200 miles of my state, I think about 28%, if I'm recalling correctly, approve. 28%. I keep hoping that something will bring my Democratic colleagues, including the administration, to the table so we can engage in practical problem solving. That's what needs to happen. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to express my views, and look forward to hearing from the witnesses and asking some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cornyn. Well, I would normally turn to Senator Durbin for opening remarks at this point. He could not be here today.
President, as we all know by now, last Friday, President Biden submitted an emergency funding request to Congress. As we all expected, it calls for funding to support Israel as it defends itself against the terrorist organization known as Hamas, a proxy for Iran. It also asks for funding for Ukraine, which continues its heroic defense against a Russian invasion. It requests funding to strengthen security in the Indo-Pacific to help our friends and allies combat increasingly aggressive threats from China. And notably, President Biden has also called for emergency funding to help address the crisis at the southern border. At face value, this shouldn't be surprising. After all, the Biden border crisis has been raging for nearly 3 years, and somehow it continues to get worse every day. Last month, Customs and Border Protection logged nearly 270,000 migrant crossings at the southern border, making it the busiest month on record.
In total, nearly 2.5 million migrants have entered the United States since last fiscal year, or during the last fiscal year. That's another record. We don't have the resources or the personnel to deal with this influx in what we all should hope would be an efficient, fair, and humane way. And that needs to change. First of all, we need to wrest immigration out of the hands of the cartels who care nothing about the people who smuggle individuals into the United States for money, a lot of money. It's a very profitable business. And there are also their affiliated cartels that are smuggling the drugs into the United States that killed 108,000 Americans last year alone. That's also the source of a lot of money for these criminal organizations, again, who care nothing about the life or welfare of individuals, either the migrants or people in the United States. And that's what happens when you outsource immigration controls to criminal organizations, as the Biden administration has done. The president's funding request does include a few items that are definitely needed, starting with additional Border Patrol agents. Personnel shortages have impacted all of our missions at the border, including those that have nothing to do with migration. More Border Patrol agents would help fill the gaps and alleviate the strain on frontline law enforcement. But this change is meaningless unless we address the polygraph examination, which is a major barrier for hiring. Just to be clear, the policy on passing a polygraph varies so much from agency to agency, but currently the policy employed by the Border Patrol has basically made it impossible to fill the quota of Border Patrol agents that we seek to hire. The administration's also asked for 375 new immigration judge teams. There's no doubt that our immigration courts are drowning under a rapidly growing case backlog. In 2020, before President Biden took office, there were just under 1.3 million cases pending in the immigration courts. But thanks to the administration's current policies, the backlog has now doubled to 2.6 million cases. Simply adding more judges will be an exercise in futility unless we also address the pull factors of the policies that are causing the backlog to grow at such an alarming pace. I'm reminded of something the former chief of the Border Patrol said amidst another migration surge. In the summer of 2019, border crossings were on the rise, although they paled in comparison to what we're seeing now. But then Chief Carla Provost testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee and talked about what it would take to fix the situation. She said, "We cannot address this crisis by shifting more resources. It's like holding a bucket under a faucet, and it doesn't matter how many buckets you have if you don't turn the water off." The president's request for emergency funding is a bucket, a relatively small one, but it does nothing to stop the flow. The only way to do that is by deterrence, and the only way to achieve deterrence is by delivering consequences for entering the country illegally. We need to send a message to the people who have no legitimate reason to remain in the United States that if they come, they will not be able to stay. President Biden does not seem to understand that. In his emergency funding request, he asked Congress to provide for non-custodial housing for migrants in expedited removal proceedings. This is a process that allows law enforcement to quickly remove migrants who have no legitimate reason to remain in the United States. I'm talking about expedited removal now. The idea that we would release migrants who are on the verge of being deported is patently absurd and just shows the chaos and confusion and the lack of any logical coherence in the Biden border policy. Anyone who believes that these individuals would come back for their removal hearing is living in an alternate reality. This would constitute, yes, yet another massive pull factor, attracting people to make that journey to the border. President Biden also called on Congress to expand the so-called lawful pathways his administration created. But to be clear, there's nothing lawful about these pathways. The administration once again has usurped Congress's authority and paroling entire classes of migrants into the United States. Parole is a technical term, basically means to release them, even if they're not claiming asylum, and which the Biden administration continues to do on a massive scale. Simply release people into the United States. This is, unsurprisingly, a violation of the Immigration and Nationality Act. And any effort to expand these so-called pathways is a non-starter in Congress. We will not legitimize these unauthorized programs and provide an even bigger incentive for migrants to make the dangerous journey to the border. We need to discourage people who have no legitimate claim to come to the United States this way, not bolster an incentive package. In my view, there are two broad goals that need to be met in order to address this crisis in a meaningful way. First, we need to end catch and release. So far, the administration has sent a message to people around the world that if you enter the United States illegally, there's a good chance you'll be able to stay, which in turn only encourages more people to come. Just show up at the border, say the magic words, and then disappear into the great American heartland. We need to revise this message and make it clear that only those with a legitimate claim can remain in the United States. Ending catch and release is the most effective way to do that. Number two, the administration must remove people who have been determined to have no legal right to enter or remain in the United States. The Biden administration has proven it does not take this responsibility seriously. Last year, or in 2021, arrests and deportation by ICE, known as Immigration and Customs Enforcement, reached an all-time low. So not only are more people coming into the country than we've ever seen before, but fewer people are going out who have no legitimate basis to stay here. In 2021, the agency carried out fewer than 60,000 deportations that year, the lowest number on record by a long shot. The following year, the number of deportations increased slightly, but not nearly enough to make an impact, and certainly not enough to discourage people from continuing to come illegally to enter the United States. Apprehensions are at record highs, deportations are at historic lows, and it's clear that this is all part of somebody's plan. Despite having every tool at its disposal, the administration's trying to move a mountain with a teaspoon. It's doing just enough to make some people think they're doing something meaningful without having any real impact. While I'm glad President Biden seems to have awakened to the fact that the status quo at the border is unsustainable, his emergency funding request shows he is still absolutely disinterested in solving this crisis. He's proven once again that he doesn't care about deterring illegal immigration. He doesn't care about delivering consequences to individuals who break our laws, and he doesn't care about solving this crisis. He merely wants to manage the flow, not stop it. This is not a serious proposal. Some of the proposed spending is actually harmful, and the positive aspects are just window dressing. The president needs to get serious about the border, and what he sent us is not serious. One thing is certain, the Senate will not rubber stamp his paltry border request. You can be certain of that. This emergency funding bill will absolutely include more funding to address the border crisis, but this is about more than funding. It's about the appropriate policies. We need real changes which produce real consequences, real ways to turn off the flow of illegal immigration and continuing to enrich the criminal organizations that smuggle people and drugs across our border. Later this week, I'm eager to talk with some of the true experts on the border crisis about the current challenges they're facing. Senator Cruz and I are leading another visit to the Rio Grande Valley, and I'm glad that Senator Ricketts, Senator Lee, and Senator Barrasso will join us. We're going to spend some time talking to the Border Patrol agents who actually work on the ground as well as the customs officers who deal with the consequences of the administration's failed policies day in and day out. We'll tour the border to see how virtually anyone, from vulnerable migrant children to dangerous drug cartel members to people on the terrorist watch list, are able to enter the United States. And we'll hear from state officials, local law enforcement, and landowners about the broader impact of the border crisis in communities across our state. It's going to be two busy and informative days. And as always, I'm grateful to the men and women who take the time to meet with us, who are doing the hard job. It would be nice if they knew that this administration had their back, but they are demoralized despite the fact that they continue to do their job day in and day out because they realize that the Biden border policies are designed to fail. Their insight, however, is invaluable to my work here in the Senate, and there couldn't be a more important time to hear from the frontline experts who know about this crisis and how to solve it better than anyone else. I especially commend my colleagues from Wyoming, Utah, and Nebraska for taking the time to make this important trip and their willingness to hear from Senator Cruz and my constituents on the front lines of this issue. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Hold your water.
Okay.
Is anybody not ready? All right, great, let's do it.
Well, good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here with my colleague from Texas, Senator Cruz, Senator Ricketts from the great state of Nebraska, Senator Lee from the great state of Utah, Senator Barrasso from Wyoming was here with us but had to leave just a few moments ago. We've had another great visit here in the Valley. The main reason Senator Cruz and I invite our colleagues to come here is because of the complexity, shall we say, of what's going on here. But first, before I talk a little bit about what we saw and what we all learned, I just want to honor San Benito police officer Lieutenant Milton Resendez, who was killed in the line of duty this week. Our prayers, of course, are with his family and his brothers and sisters in blue as they mourn his tragic loss. It's no news to anybody that the Biden administration has seen historic levels of irregular or illegal mass migration across the southern border. And you might ask, what's changed? Well, a number of things have changed. Historically, immigration was poor people coming from Mexico, Central America that wanted to work in the United States. Today, people are traveling literally from around the world and showing up at the ports of entry and claiming asylum, or because of the sheer volume of people coming across, the Biden administration is simply releasing them into the interior of the United States without any real consequences. If you listen to the Border Patrol, what they tell you is there's no consequences, which is another way of saying there's no deterrent for people not to come or to come only through regular legal channels. I believe, and I'm sure my colleagues would agree with me, legal immigration has been a blessing to our country, truly has. Illegal immigration is a disaster because the Biden administration is outsourcing immigration to drug cartels, transnational criminal organizations who care nothing about the people. All they care about is the money. And we saw the Brooks County Sheriff was showing us pictures of bleached bones and human remains of migrants who have been left behind in Brooks County as they tried to circumvent the Falfurrias checkpoint. This is a disaster. It's a humanitarian disaster. It is a public safety disaster. Before I hand it over to Senator Cruz, let me just point out two other things. We focus a lot on the migrants who've come across, and certainly there have been millions, as many maybe as 7 million, including 1.5 million gotaways trying to evade law enforcement. But there's not enough attention to being paid to the 108,000 Americans who lost their lives last year as a result of drugs coming across the border, including 71,000 from fentanyl alone. As you will hear from my colleagues, fentanyl is the leading cause of death of 18 to 45-year-olds in the United States. The leading cause of death from a drug that is manufactured, in essence, in Mexico and smuggled across the border into the interior. And then there's the 300,000 children who've been lost by the Biden administration. The New York Times alone has documented that as many as 85,000 phone calls were made to sponsors of these unaccompanied children, only to go unanswered 30 days after they've been placed with the sponsor. They can't tell you whether they're going to school, whether they're getting the health care that they need, whether they're being abused, neglected, trafficked for sex, forced into involuntary labor. They can't tell you. And the truth is they don't care. Because if they did care, they would do something about it. So, you know, the Rio Grande Valley is one of my favorite places to come. I'm sure Senator Cruz feels the same way. This is a vibrant part of our state. It's unique, and there's another reason why I love to have our colleagues come. They've learned a lot about the importance of binational trade between Mexico and the United States and how many jobs that creates here in America and in Mexico as well. And so we have something special here, but unfortunately it's being spoiled by the Biden administration's reckless policies that do nothing to deter illegal immigration and facilitate, frankly, the death of 108,000 Americans last year alone, and hundreds of thousands of lost children lost to sponsors in the interior of the United States with unknown outcomes. With that, let me turn it over to Senator Cruz.
Madam President, as we all are painfully aware, at home and around the globe, America is facing a vast array of security threats. There's war in the Middle East, war in Europe, growing instability and threats of conflict in the Indo-Pacific, and of course there's the unprecedented security crisis at our own southern border. Unlike threats in the other parts of the world, the border crisis wasn't caused by our adversaries. It wasn't caused by the actions of an authoritarian leader or events beyond our control. The border crisis is an unforced error. It's the result of intentional decisions and policy positions taken by the Biden administration. For nearly 3 years, President Biden and leaders in his administration have sent a signal to people around the world that America's southern border is open. All you need to do is show up. Clearly, their message came through loud and clear, much to the delight of the criminal organizations that transport people, human smuggling, and the drug dealers who've exploited this vulnerability. Clearly, they got the message too, and they're getting richer every day. Since President Biden took office, we've logged nearly 6.3 million illegal border crossings, plus at least 1.7 million known gotaways. Now, the Border Patrol calls a gotaway somebody who has been detected on a camera or on a radar screen, but when they show up to try to detain them, they simply have vanished. Those are the gotaways, and there were 1.7 million of them, known gotaways, in just 3 years. So that's all total, roughly 8 million people crossing our border during the Biden administration. People from every part of the globe are showing up at our border. In a single year, migrants from 174 different countries crossed our southern border. And what they've learned to do is to claim asylum, and then they know they will be released to await a potential future court date that may be as long as 10 years in the future. Meantime, they get on with their lives, they marry, they have children who are American citizens, and the simple truth is they are not going anywhere. We know that if they did show up for their immigration court hearing, that only about 15% would legally qualify for asylum under the current law. So word has gotten out that under the Biden administration, our southern border is open, and if you show up, you'll be released into the interior. And that has provided an enormous magnet, or in the nomenclature of the Border Patrol, they call that a pull factor. It's a huge pull factor or magnet for people around the world saying, all you have to do is show up and the Biden administration will release you into the interior of the United States. So it should be no surprise that migrants are pouring across the border in record numbers. So is fentanyl, which took the lives of 71,000 Americans last year alone. We also know that there are people on the terrorist watch list who are showing up at the border. But what I really worry about is those on the terrorist watch list who were part of the 1.7 million gotaways. In other words, we don't know how many people on the terrorist watch list have made their way into the interior of the United States as a result of the Biden border crisis. So, what do? Well, the Biden administration thinks that all we need to do is spend more money on the current system. We know that that tends to be a common response around here, just throw more money at a problem. They tried to solve the inflation problem by spending hundreds of billions of dollars on things like EV tax credits and a supersized IRS. That gave us a 40-year high inflation rate that still hasn't abated yet. Then they tried to address the student loan crisis by shifting the debt from the people who owed it and who borrowed it and who are legally responsible for it to taxpayers. Another massive fail. And now they claim they can solve the border crisis by writing another big check. Needless to say, we should all be skeptical. To be clear, funding is important, but funding for the right things is even more important. In order for anything to change at the border, we need real, substantive policy changes. Last month, the White House issued a supplemental funding request to respond to major national security threats that we are facing today, including the border. But as I and others have pointed out, the border portion of President Biden's funding request is completely inadequate. His request would actually worsen the border crisis, such as a request for more non-custodial housing, options for migrants in expedited removal proceedings. This would allow migrants who are on the verge of being deported to be released into the United States, the opposite of what we should be doing. It would constitute yet another pull factor for anyone considering a journey to the border. On the whole, the Biden administration request demonstrates exactly how non-serious they are about solving this crisis. One example is their request for more detention beds. Now, to be clear, more detention beds are needed. But I think it'd be helpful for President Biden and some of our colleagues to review the math here. Border Patrol roughly has 20,000 detention beds now, which are strictly for short-term detention. ICE, or Immigration and Customs Enforcement, has another 20,000 beds for migrants in expedited removal. Now, those may sound like big numbers, but the beds fill up quickly. In September, nearly 270,000 migrants crossed the southern border. That's an average of 9,000 a day. If we were to start with a clean slate, all the Border Patrol beds would be filled in 2 days. Migrants who are placed in expedited removal and are seeking asylum are supposed to complete a credible fear screening, a process which takes approximately 13 days. If the administration wanted to do things by the book, in other words, if they wanted to follow the law, we'd need the capacity to hold every person who crossed the border for 2 weeks just to figure out whether they had a serious claim for asylum, and then a longer period to evaluate those claims. And what they've requested clearly will not allow that to happen. And just to reemphasize the point, that's just to figure out if an asylum claim is plausible on its face before an immigration court determines whether it is supported by adequate evidence. That success rate is roughly 15%, which means the people who are waiting in line, those 15% who have legitimate claims, can't even get their claims heard because of all the people who have no legitimate claims clogging the dockets of the immigration courts. So, as you can see, at current levels, we would need hundreds of thousands of detention beds. That's because the Biden administration has allowed this crisis to grow to such epic proportions that it can't be fixed by just more officers or a small increase in detention beds. 9,000 illegal border crossings a day is evidence of a policy problem, not just a funding problem. More funding would actually be useless until we address the pull factors that are bringing these people here. Last week, a group of Senate Republicans released a proposal that could serve as a starting point for negotiations in the Senate. But unlike the president's request, it includes real, substantive policy changes to address the pull factors that are drawing people from around the world to our southern border. In order to restore some control, we need deterrence. We need consequences for people breaking the rules and trying to come in illegally. We need to show people who have no legitimate claim to remain in the United States that if they come, they will not be able to stay. That is what will provide the consequences and deterrence that will prevent massive numbers of additional migrants from attempting the trip to our border. If they know that they're unlikely to be successful, they're unlikely to spend the thousands of dollars that they have to spend now to the criminal organizations to transport them to our border. And if they don't come, that will alleviate some of the massive influx of humanity which has prevented the Border Patrol from interdicting the drugs that took the lives of 108,000 Americans last year alone. That's where the criminal organizations or cartels are also getting rich. Smuggling people, smuggling drugs. I continue to be dumbfounded by the unwillingness of our Democratic colleagues and the President of the United States from recognizing what a disaster this really is. Since President Biden took office, our country has logged more illegal border crossings than it did under the previous two administrations combined. We know that migrants are placing a massive strain on many of our major American cities, including sanctuary cities like New York and Chicago. At the same time, fentanyl and other dangerous drugs are killing our youth. Fentanyl, or synthetic opioids, are now the leading cause of death for 18 to 45-year-olds in America. You think that would get somebody's attention here in the nation's capital or at the White House? No community has been spared from the devastation of these drugs. And as I said, last fiscal year so far, we've seen about 169 people on the terrorist watch list encountered at the border. Last year, the Border Patrol detained more people on the terrorist watch list than it did in the previous 6 years combined. So our adversaries clearly see this as an opportunity to enter the United States with nobody the wiser. And of course, as I said, this doesn't account for all the people who came in who were on the terrorist watch list or who do have evil designs on our country who were part of the 1.7 million gotaways. It's no overstatement to say the border crisis is a massive security threat to our country. It's putting every community in America at risk. If our Democratic colleagues are willing to help America's friends and allies, like Israel and Ukraine, they should be willing to help their own constituents and help defend their own country against this influx of humanity. Biden's mishandling of the border has created a major national security risk, and the Senate deserves and needs to treat this matter with all seriousness. Republicans are not interested in just throwing money at the current system. Wasteful, inefficient spending is not the solution here. We need to fundamentally shift the dynamics at the southern border, and that will require real, substantial policy changes. Madam President, I yield the floor. I'd note the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.